Hello guys, and welcome back to Sleepy Battle Stories. Tonight, we sail into the vast Pacific, where distance was measured in thousands of miles, silence lasted for days, and the ocean itself felt like a witness holding its breath. This is the Battle of Midway, June 4th to 7th, 1942. A battle fought not by chance encounters, but by broken codes, quiet calculations, and the gamble of admirals who knew they would not get a second roll of the dice. Imagine the setting before the storm. A tiny coral atoll sitting alone in endless blue. American carriers moving like shadows on uncertain water. Japanese fleets advancing with precision and confidence, believing victory was already written somewhere beyond the horizon. There were no warning sirens here, no trenches, no front lines drawn in soil, only flight decks, radio rooms, and pilots strapping into aircraft in pre-dawn darkness, unsure if they were flying toward triumph or oblivion. Then came the moment the sky opened. Dive bombers. Screaming downward like falling stars, engines roaring over open water, bombs splitting the calm, carriers erupting into pillars of smoke that could be seen for miles. In mere minutes, an empire's momentum burned on its own steel decks. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost, and with them, the certainty that one side alone could rule the Pacific. This was the day the tide turned, not with marching boots, but with wings, fire, and the fragile brilliance of a plan that dared to work. So if you love stories where history pivots on intellect and nerve, where oceans decide the fate of nations, leave a like and subscribe. Not because you should, but because these are the stories that carry you between wonder and sleep. And before we begin, tell me softly where you're listening from tonight. Across seas, across time zones, across quiet rooms, you're here, sharing the moment when the world shifted on the open water. Now, let the Pacific stretch out in your mind, let the battle's echoes drift into calm, and let's ease into the story of the day the impossible was dared and delivered. The Pacific Ocean, in the spring of 1942, was a vast, brooding expanse of deep blues and greys, a stage of unimaginable scale upon which empires were contending for ultimate mastery. It was a realm defined not by the familiar contours of continents, but by the haunting emptiness between tiny, isolated specks of land, by the immense weight of its own depths, and by the immense latent power contained within its sprawling quiet. For the United States of America, this ocean had become a trench of profound national humiliation and searing grief. The memory of December 7th, 1941 was not a memory at all, but a raw, open wound, a column of black smoke that still seemed to rise from the shattered battleships in Pearl Harbor, staining the national consciousness. The American fleet, the proud Pacific Fleet, had been caught asleep and bludgeoned into ruin, its mightiest vessels, symbols of a bygone doctrine, resting in the mud of the shallows. In the months that followed, this shock metastasized into a relentless tide of Japanese conquest. The rising sun flag flew over Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies in a seemingly unstoppable parade of victory. The Japanese martial machine appeared invincible, a perfect, disciplined engine of conquest driven by a sense of divine destiny and tactical brilliance. The social order of the Pacific, a colonial framework maintained by Western powers for a century, had been utterly shattered, replaced by a new, brutal hierarchy imposed from Tokyo. In Washington, a grim, determined man named Ernest J. King presided over the U.S. Navy as its commander-in-chief. His was a face carved from New England granite, all sharp angles and unyielding resolve, a man whose natural belligerence was precisely the tonic needed in a time of catastrophe. He understood that the war would be won in the Pacific and won by aircraft carriers, the new queens of the naval chessboard. His counterpart in the Pacific, the man entrusted with the actual fighting, was Chester W. Nimitz. If king was the iron fist, Nimitz was the steady, calculating hand that wielded it. He arrived in Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day 1941, stepping into a headquarters thick with the smell of defeat and the paralysis of shock. His task was not merely to command, but to rebuild a broken Navy soul. Calm, deliberate, and possessed of an almost preternatural sense of balance, Nimitz listened more than he spoke. He retained the defeated commanders, understanding that they held the hard-won lessons of failure in their bones. He projected a serene confidence that was itself a weapon, a deliberate antidote to the panic that lurked in the shadows. Across the ocean, in the halls of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet headquarters aboard the super battleship, Yamato, a different kind of mind, was plotting the next decisive act. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, was the architect of Pearl Harbor. A complex, contradictory figure, he was a gambler who loved bridge and poker, a nationalist who had lived in America and understood its terrifying industrial potential. He was haunted by a premonition. If the war lasted long, Japan's fleeting advantage would be crushed beneath the awesome weight of American production. His strategy, therefore, was one of desperate finality. He must force a decisive, climactic battle, a Kantai Kessen, that would annihilate the remaining American carrier forces in one glorious, definitive engagement. Only then, with the US Navy broken and the American will shattered, could Japan negotiate a favorable peace and secure its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Yamamoto's ambition was grand, his strategic vision clear, yet it was tempered by a deep personal fear, the fear of waking the sleeping giant completely and furnishing it with a rage it could not contain. The instrument for this decisive blow was to be a small coral atoll, barely a speck on the map, Midway. Two low-lying islands, Eastern and Sand, situated roughly halfway between Asia and North America. To the American public it was unknown. To strategists it was an obscure outpost. But to Yamamoto it was the perfect bait. He would attack and invade Midway. The Americans, bound by the imperative to defend their territory, would surely rush their precious carriers to its rescue. There, waiting in ambush with the overwhelming might of the combined fleet, would be Yamamoto's battleships and carriers. The American fleet would be drawn into a trap from which there could be no escape, and the Pacific War would end in a single thunderous afternoon. The plan, dubbed Operation MI, was breathtaking in its audacity and complexity, involving multiple battle groups scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was a masterpiece of martial choreography, requiring perfect timing, flawless communication, and, above all, the element of complete surprise. The pride of Japan, the veteran carrier divisions that had raided Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the southern seas, would be the spearhead. Commanding this first carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor. A solid, dependable battleship admiral, he was a master of the tactical strike, but he carried within him the cautious instincts of the gun-line officer. He had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with brutal efficiency, yet he had left the fuel tanks and repair facilities untouched, a decision that already gnawed at the edges of Yamamoto's grand design. Nagumo's ambition was to serve faithfully, to repeat his earlier success, but a latent fear lingered within him, the fear of the unknown counterpunch, of the American resilience he did not fully comprehend. Beneath the surface of these sweeping strategies and the movements of fleets, hidden tensions coursed like submerged currents, threatening to pull the grand design apart from within. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not a monolith of unified thought, but a fractious organism riddled with rivalries and doctrinal schisms. Yamamoto's Midway plan was, in fact, born not from unanimous acclaim, but from a fierce and bitter internal struggle. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo, led by Admiral Osamu Nagano, favoured a continuation of the Southern strategy, an offensive toward Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia to sever the lifeline between America and Australia. They saw Yamamoto's thrust into the Central Pacific as a risky diversion, an overextension of precious forces. Yamamoto, leveraging the immense prestige his Pearl Harbor success afforded him, had to threaten resignation to force the plan through. This victory was Pyrrhic. It planted seeds of resentment and created a dangerous lack of wholehearted commitment from the very staff meant to support the operation. The plan itself became a compromise, further weakened by the insistence of the Army and General Staff on a simultaneous, distracting invasion of the Aleutian Islands in the north. This bifurcation of force was a critical dilution of strength, born from inter-service rivalry and a desire to appease multiple strategic opinions, violating the sacred military principle of concentration. Within the Kido Butai itself, tensions simmered. Admiral Nagumo, the on-scene commander, was a practitioner of the decisive gun battle, a man who viewed carriers as supportive instruments to soften up the enemy for the final climactic engagement between battleships. His air operations officer, Commander Minoru Genda, was a visionary, a fervent apostle of air power who believed the carriers were the decisive weapon. Genda and the brilliant aggressive flight leaders like Commander Mitsuo Fushida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, chafed under Nagumo's inherent caution. They understood the carrier's offensive potential was total and brittle. Their strength lay in launching overwhelming coordinated strikes. The idea of being used as bait or of being forced into a defensive posture was anathema to their doctrine. Furthermore, the relationship between Nagumo and Yamamoto was one of functional distance, not warm trust. Yamamoto, the grand strategist and gambler, remained aboard the Yamato, far to the rear with the main body of battleships. Nagumo, the executor, was left at the tip of the spear. There was an unspoken paternal disappointment from Yamamoto, who privately questioned Nagumo's capacity for the ruthless, adaptive decision-making this complex operation would demand. Nagumo, for his part, felt the weight of expectation and the silent criticism of his superior, a pressure that could cloud judgment. On the American side, the tensions were of a different sort, born from trauma and the desperate scramble to catch up. The command structure in Pearl Harbor was a tense ecosystem. Admiral Nimitz's greatest asset and his greatest source of potential conflict was his intelligence officer, Commander Joseph Rochefort. A cryptanalyst of genius, Rochefort was an eccentric, brilliant man who often worked in a worn red smoking jacket in the dank basement combat intelligence unit known as the Dungeon. He and his team were engaged in the Herculean task of breaking the Japanese naval code, JN-25. Rochefort's world was one of probability, nuance, and arcane deduction, often at odds with the demand for certainty from operations staff. His immediate superior in Washington, Captain John Redman of Navy Communications, viewed Rochefort's unorthodox methods and direct line to Nimitz with suspicion and jealousy, a rivalry that threatened the very flow of vital intelligence. The American carrier commanders themselves were a new breed, thrust into prominence by the destruction of the battleships. Vice. Admiral William F. Halsey, aggressive and popular, was the public face of American naval resolve, a sailor who believed in hitting hard and constantly. But as the Midway operation coalesced, Halsey was stricken with a severe skin disease, forced to watch from a hospital bed. His replacement, chosen by Nimitz, was Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of Halsey's escort cruisers. Spruance was Halsey's opposite, quiet, cerebral, meticulous, and untested in carrier command. The appointment raised eyebrows. Could this calm, thoughtful man, a surface warfare officer by trade, possess the killer instinct needed to take on the legendary Kido Butai? The other task force contained the carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, with overall command falling to the more experienced but also more conventionally minded Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. The dynamic between the instinctual Fletcher and the calculating Spruance was untested, a potential point of friction in the heat of battle. All these human contradictions, ambition, fear, rivalry, doctrinal clash, played out against the backdrop of the vast, indifferent Pacific. The ocean itself was a character, its immense distances compressing time and amplifying error, its weather patterns capable of hiding fleets or exposing them, its very emptiness a psychological weight. For the Americans, it was a defensive moat that had been breached. For the Japanese, it was a new imperial lake they believed was their destiny to rule. The stage was set, the principal actors were moving into position, guided by plans they believed were sound, burdened by tensions they barely acknowledged. The social order of the Pacific had been disrupted. Now, the battle to define its new order was imminent. The first move in Yamamoto's grand gambit was already underway, a movement of ships and men so vast it seemed to defy detection. But in a basement in Pearl Harbor, a man in a red smoking jacket surrounded by piles of paper and the incessant clatter of decryption machines was beginning to piece together a terrifying and magnificent puzzle. The status quo, a reality of relentless Japanese advance, was poised on the edge of a knife. A single piece of intelligence, a single deduction could destabilize everything. The incident that would irrevocably destabilize the strategic picture and shatter Yamamoto's prized veil of secrecy began not with a bang, but with an exhaustively debated hypothesis. In the claustrophobic confines of the dungeon at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and intelligence analysts lived in a world of fragmented messages, partial decryptions, and educated guesswork. They had pierced the outer layers of the Japanese naval code JN-25, enough to read perhaps 10-15% of any given message, but that percentage, when combined with traffic analysis, studying the volume, origin, and recipients of signals, could reveal shadows of immense substance. Through April and May 1942, a pattern emerged. Japanese signal traffic pointed to a major operation brewing. A target was referred to consistently as AF. Rochefort, correlating every scrap of data, became convinced that AF was Midway. His evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Previous cables had mentioned AF in context relating to its water distillation plant, and it lay along the line of Japanese advance. The tension, however, lay in convincing the skeptical minds in Washington. The Naval Intelligence Office, particularly Captain John Redman and his brother Commander Joseph Redman, favoured the theory of the General Staff, that the next Japanese thrust would be in the South Pacific, aimed at Port Moresby, or even the West Coast. They dismissed Rochefort's Midway theory as speculative, the product of an overworked and perhaps egotistical unit in Hawaii. This was more than an intellectual disagreement, it was a bureaucratic war for credibility, with the fate of the Pacific Fleet as its prize. The atmosphere in Rochefort's dungeon grew thick with frustration and a sense of desperate urgency. Nimitz, who trusted Rochefort implicitly, needed irrefutable proof to commit his only 3 serviceable carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the badly wounded Yorktown, to a single decisive point in the ocean. To guess wrong would be to leave Hawaii or the West Coast exposed, or to send the carriers on a wild goose chase while the real blow fell elsewhere. It was then that Rochefort and his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, conceived of a ruse of elegant simplicity. They proposed that the garrison on Midway, via an insecure plain language cable, send a false message stating that their water distillation plant had broken down and they were running short of fresh water. The request was approved. The signal went out, a tiny deliberate leak in the vastness of the ether. Then the cryptanalysts waited, the tension in the basement palpable. They did not wait long. Within 48 hours, a decrypted Japanese intercept, sent from a reconnaissance unit to the combined fleet, reported that AF was running short of fresh water. The trap had been sprung, the bait taken. The confirmation was absolute and electrifying. AF was indisputably Midway. This single, brilliant piece of psychological judo destabilized the entire Japanese plan. The element of surprise, the cornerstone upon which Yamamoto's intricate trap was built, had been catastrophically compromised. The Americans now knew the target, the approximate timing, and, through further brilliant analysis, the rough order of battle. Nimitz was no longer reacting. He was preparing a counter-ambush. The revelation forced a profound and immediate reaction from Chester Nimitz. His command decisions in the days that followed were a masterclass in calm, decisive leadership under extreme pressure. First, he ordered Midway fortified to the greatest extent possible, every available aircraft, antiquated Brewster Buffalo fighters, B-17 flying fortresses, PBY Catalina patrol bombers, and even Army B-26 Marauders rigged with torpedoes, was flown to the atoll. It was to become an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a fixed bastion that would absorb the first blow and bleed the Kido Butai. Second, and most critically, he summoned his carrier forces. Halsey's Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet was recalled from the South Pacific. Spruance, stepping into Halsey's role, hurriedly familiarized himself with carrier operations on the frantic voyage north. The most dramatic decision concerned the carrier Yorktown. She had been grievously wounded at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, with a gaping hole in her flight deck and near fatal internal damage. Estimates in Pearl Harbor's dry dock said she needed 90 days of repairs. Nimitz surveyed the ship, her hangar deck a cavern of twisted steel and burned-out wreckage. He gave the yard workers 72 hours, 3 days. It was an impossible order, a testament to the desperate need. Civilians and sailors worked around the clock, torches flaring in the night, hammers ringing incessantly. The Yorktown was made seaworthy and capable of operating aircraft. Though she remained a patched and vulnerable warrior, her wounds hastily bandaged, not healed. Under Frank Jack Fletcher, she sailed to join Spruance, forming Task Force 17. On the Japanese side, blissfully unaware that their cipher had been breached, the fleet continued its majestic, confident advance. The Keido Butai, 6 fleet carriers strong, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, was the most powerful naval striking force the world had ever seen. However, even here, the hidden tensions and unresolved conflicts were manifesting in material weakness. Shokaku was heavily damaged at Coral Sea, and Zuikaku's air group was decimated. Both were out of the operation. Nagumo would sail with only 4 veterans, though he considered them more than sufficient. The complex dispersal of forces proceeded, the invasion convoy for Midway, the close support group with cruisers and battleships, the main body under Yamamoto with the mighty Yamato, and the northern force destined for the Aleutians. This fragmentation, a product of the earlier bureaucratic compromises, meant that Nagumo's carrier force, the true centre of gravity, was not supported by immediate heavy gun support. He was the bait, the hammer, and the anvil all in one, a tremendous concentration of air power, but operating in a tactical vacuum, isolated by design. The fleet sailed under a profound culturally ingrained assumption of superiority and an unshakable belief in their own secrecy. Radio silence was strict, the mood one of sombre certainty. They were sailing to finish a war, to administer the coup de grace. No alarm bells rang in the Yamato's communications center. No suspicion clouded Nagumo's mind. The destabilizing incident in the Rochefort's dungeon had created 2 parallel realities, one of American foreknowledge and focused preparation, the other of Japanese confidence and unwitting exposure. The fleets, one aware, one oblivious, converged on a point in the sea, their trajectories tracing the invisible lines of deduced intention and flawed assumption. As the opposing fleets churned through the night-shrouded Pacific towards their fateful rendezvous, the alliances and loyalties within each command structure solidified under the mounting pressure of impending combat. For the Americans, the command alliance between Fletcher and Spruance, forged in the crucible of this crisis, became the operational cornerstone. Nimitz from Pearl Harbor had issued clear, flexible orders. Fletcher, as the senior officer, was in overall tactical command. His guiding principle was to inflict maximum damage on the enemy by employing strong attrition tactics, but he was explicitly instructed to not lose his carriers. It was a directive that balanced aggression with preservation, a reflection of Nimitz's understanding of their fragile strength. Fletcher, aboard the patched-up Yorktown, and Spruance on the Enterprise, had to translate this into a cohesive battle plan without the benefit of shared experience. Their partnership was one of necessity, not deep camaraderie, but it was grounded in a mutual professional respect and a shared understanding of the stakes. Spruance, the chess player, absorbed every scrap of intelligence, every detail of the Kido Butai's known capabilities. Fletcher, the veteran of Coral Sea, knew the savage, chaotic nature of carrier combat firsthand. Their loyalty was not to each other personally, but to the mission Nimitz had defined, to ambush the ambushers. This unity stood in stark contrast to the fragmented Japanese command architecture. Yamamoto's grand design had physically dispersed his forces over hundreds of miles, creating a command and control nightmare. The main body, with its massive battleships, trailed over 300 miles behind Nagumo's carriers, too far to offer support or influence the opening carrier duel. The invasion force and the close support group were separate entities, plodding along on their own schedules. The alliance here was one of assumed synchronization, not active coordination. Each group sailed in its own bubble of radio silence, trusting the plan to unfold as written. Loyalty was vertical and absolute, to the Emperor, to the chain of command, but horizontal coordination between task forces was brittle, dependent on a timetable that could not survive contact with the enemy. Most dangerously, Nagumo aboard Akagi saw himself as the independent executor of the first critical phase, the neutralization of Midway. His loyalty was to that specific task. The larger strategic objective of luring the American carriers was, in his mind, a subsequent step, almost a separate operation. This mental compartmentalization would prove fatal. On Midway itself, a different kind of alliance was being tested, that between the naval aviators, marine defenders, and Army Air Force crews thrown together on the tiny atoll. They were the tripwire, the anvil against which the Japanese hammer would first fall. Their loyalty was to the ground under their feet, to the idea that this worthless speck of coral had to be held. Commander Logan Ramsey, the naval air commander on Midway, and Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, the Marine Defense Commander, worked tirelessly to turn the island into a porcupine. They had no illusions about stopping an invasion if the Japanese carriers ruled the skies. Their job was to bleed Nagumo, to force him to divert his attention and resources, to buy time for the American carrier forces lurking to the northeast. The pilots of the obsolete Brewster Buffaloes knew their machines were death traps compared to the Japanese Zero. Their loyalty was to each other, to the desperate hope that their sacrifice might matter in a larger calculus they could not see. Early decisions, seemingly minor, began to pile up, creating a cascade of irreversible consequences. Nimitz's decision to repair the Yorktown in 3 days was one. Another was his instruction to Spruance: "You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk." This phrase granted Spruance the moral authority to use his own judgment, to be aggressive but not reckless. For the Japanese, a critical early decision was the timing of their pre-invasion airstrike on Midway. Nagumo's strike was scheduled for dawn on June 4th, launched from a position 250 miles northwest of the atoll. This required his carriers to steam boldly toward their target, potentially exposing themselves. A concurrent decision to arm his reserve aircraft on deck with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a potential encounter with ships was logical on paper but created a dangerous rigidity. The process of rearming aircraft on the crowded, volatile flight decks was time-consuming and labor-intensive. Switching from land attack to anti-ship ordnance was not a simple switch, but a major evolution. This procedural reality became a hidden trap. Perhaps the most fateful early decision was Yamamoto's insistence on maintaining absolute radio silence. It was a standard security precaution, but it had a paradoxical effect. It blinded him. Because his scattered forces could not communicate, they could not adjust to unforeseen circumstances. And because he believed secrecy was intact, he assumed no unforeseen circumstances would arise. Furthermore, a crucial reconnaissance mission, a long-range seaplane sweep from the French frigate Shoals intended to check on Pearl Harbor, was cancelled when the Japanese found the shoals occupied by American vessels. This was another consequence of Rochefort's work. The Americans had preemptively occupied the refueling point. This cancellation meant Nagumo would have no last-minute confirmation of American carrier locations. He sailed forward, his vision artificially constricted by the very security measures meant to protect him. The die was cast not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, tense hours of planning and preparation. The American alliance, though untested, was focused, adaptive, and operating with a precious gift of foresight. The Japanese alliance, though veteran and powerful, was fragmented, ritualistic, and sailing into a more of their own unintentional devising. The long night of June 3rd, 1942 settled over the Central Pacific. Aboard the American carriers, men tried to sleep, their minds racing with diagrams of attack vectors and the known capabilities of Japanese fighters. Aboard the ships of the Kido Butai, men slept more soundly, dreaming of another glorious victory to add to their unbroken string. In the darkness, the distance between the fleets dwindled from hundreds of miles to tens. The first tentative probes were already in the air, PBY Catalinas droning through the pre-dawn murk on desperate search patterns, their crew's eyes straining against the gloom, knowing that what they might find would unleash hell. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, the vast machinery of war, set in motion by weeks of planning, deduction, and counter-planning, began its final, irrevocable turn. Events started to accelerate with a slow, terrifying momentum. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the ritual of preparation was a well-oiled ballet of controlled violence. On the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, under the pale glow of deck lights, ground crews swarmed over rows of aircraft. The smell of high-octane fuel and engine oil hung thick in the cool salt air. Pilots, many of them the veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean, received their final briefings. Their target was Midway, to crush its air power, its defenses, to clear the path for the invasion force. At 04:30, as the first grey fingers of light stretched, across the eastern horizon, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, still recovering from an appendectomy, watched from the Akagi's bridge as the first Zero fighter, engine snarling, hurtled down the flight deck and climbed into the sky. Soon, 108 aircraft, a mix of fighters, dive bombers and level bombers, formed up and droned off to the southeast, a dark swarm against the lightening sky. The strike was launched. Nagumo had thrown the first punch. To his staff, it felt like the opening act of another flawless performance. The first tremor in the Japanese reality came not from an American carrier, but from the island itself. A patrolling PBY Catalina, piloted by Lieutenant Howard Adey, sighted the Japanese carrier force at approximately 05:30. His radio message, "Enemy carriers," crackled into the command centers on Midway and with the American task forces. The ambush was sprung, but not in the way Yamamoto envisioned. The Americans knew precisely where Nagumo was. Within minutes, Midway's own strike aircraft began launching to attack the Japanese fleet. The island was not a passive target, it was striking back. Simultaneously, from the American carrier task forces lurking about 200 miles to the northeast, Fletcher and Spruance began their own launch preparations. Spruance, calculating the distance and the reported enemy position, made a critical, aggressive decision. The original plan was to launch at 09 hours when they would be closer, but fearing Nagumo might turn away, and understanding the imperative of hitting him when his decks were full of aircraft, Spruance gave the order at 0607, launch the attack. It was a decision born of intuition and cool nerve, compressing the timeline dramatically. The flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet became scenes of orchestrated chaos as engines coughed to life and aircraft began their slow, taxiing procession to the launch points. The Yorktown, holding her aircraft in reserve pending further reconnaissance, watched and waited. The accelerating events now began to outpace Japanese comprehension. At 0070, as Nagumo's strike on Midway was completing its attack, reporting significant damage but not the total neutralization required, the first American counterstrikes from the island arrived. A motley collection of obsolete Marine Corps Vindicator dive bombers and Army B-26 Marauders, armed with torpedoes, bore in on the Kido Butai. They were met by a withering storm of anti-aircraft fire and the agile, deadly Zero Combat Air Patrol. The American aircraft were slaughtered, achieving no hits. To Nagumo and his staff, watching the plumes of black smoke mark the demise of these pathetic attacks, the message seemed clear. Midway's air power was persistent but impotent. The threat was from the island, not from the sea. This reinforced Nagumo's focus on his primary mission. At 0715, he made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered the reserve aircraft on his hangar decks, which had been armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a possible naval encounter, to be rearmed with fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway. The laborious process began. Bombs and torpedoes were hauled down from the aircraft. New ordnance was brought up from the magazines. The flight decks were cluttered with ordnance, fuel hoses, and aircraft in various states of readiness. The Kido Butai was at its most vulnerable. Then, at the absolute worst possible moment, a searing piece of new information shattered Nagumo's operational picture. At 0728, a lone Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone, delayed in its launch, radioed a fragmentary, ambiguous report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The report sent a jolt through Akagi's bridge. Enemy ships? But what kind? The scout was ordered to ascertain the ship types. 10 minutes of agonizing silence followed. Below decks, the rearming operation continued. Then, at 0820, the scout's follow-up report arrived. Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. A carrier. The American fleet was not in Pearl Harbor or responding from afar. It was here to the northeast within striking distance. Nagumo was caught in a tactical nightmare. His strike aircraft were returning from Midway, low on fuel and some damaged, needing to land immediately. His combat air patrol Zeros were also low on fuel and ammunition. His flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed for a second land strike. And now, an enemy carrier threat had materialized from an unexpected quadrant. Events were now accelerating beyond anyone's control. Nagumo's mind, conditioned by doctrine and the immediate pressures, sought to regain control through a sequence of logical but ultimately disastrous decisions. He ordered the rearming to stop, but should he now arm the aircraft with anti-ship ordnance? Should he launch an immediate piecemeal strike with whatever was ready? His aggressive air staff, Genda and Fushida, urged an immediate launch, but Nagumo, the cautious battleship admiral, saw the returning Midway strike as a pressing physical reality. He made the fateful choice: recover the Midway strike first, clear the decks, rearm properly, then launch a massive coordinated blow against the American carrier. It was, in the sterile logic of a flowchart, the prudent course. But in the dynamic reality of carrier warfare, it was a death sentence. It meant over an hour of lethal vulnerability, decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, recovery operations, frantic rearming, while the Americans were already inbound. The Kido Butai began a slow turn into the wind to recover its aircraft. The great carriers, symbols of Japanese invincibility, became floating bomb magazines, steaming in predictable circles, their fate now hinging on the timing of American arrivals and the decisions of young American pilots they had never seen. The initiative, seized at Pearl Harbor, had just slipped from their grasp, transferred across the waves to the flight decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The period of manageable outcomes was over. The battle was now a race against annihilation. As Admiral Nagumo's force began its slow, fatal turn to recover aircraft, the first elements of the American counterstroke were already clawing their way through the sky, unaware of the catastrophic opportunity unfolding beneath them. The American attack, launched in haste and hope, was not a coordinated symphony, but a desperate, piecemeal series of charges. The squadrons from Hornet and Enterprise became separated in the vastness, their navigation hampered by imperfect sighting reports and the sheer difficulty of finding a moving target in an ocean of nothing. The first to arrive were the torpedo bombers. From the Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, a man of fierce intuition and stubborn will, had broken from the main group, convinced his own calculations were correct. Flying slow, obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators, aircraft that were already antiquated at the war's start, they droned on alone. At 09:20, Waldron sighted the smoke and the immense shapes of the Japanese fleet. Without fighter escort, without any other American aircraft in sight, he radioed the simple, terrible order: attack. What followed was not a battle but a massacre. The 15 Devastators of VT-8 descended to wave-top level and began their slow, straight-line approach necessary for torpedo release. They were perfect targets. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, dozens of Agile Zero fighters fell upon them like wolves. One by one, the Devastators were set ablaze, cartwheeling into the sea in blossoms of flame and spray. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening vessels and the carriers themselves laced the air with steel. Waldron's plane was hit early and crashed. In minutes, every aircraft of VT-8 was destroyed. Of the 30 men, only one, Ensign George H. Gay, would survive, clinging to a seat cushion in the water, watching the drama unfold from a horrifically intimate ringside seat. The sacrifice of VT-8 was as devastating as it was futile. Not a single torpedo found its mark. Yet it served a profound, unintended strategic purpose. The furious low-level melee had drawn the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to the deck. The Zero pilots, aggressive and disciplined, pursued the last dying Devastators with a relentless focus, leaving the middle and high altitudes largely undefended. Furthermore, the attack confirmed to Nagumo the presence of American carrier aircraft and put his entire force into a state of heightened, frenetic alert. Just as the last flames of VT-8 were being swallowed by the sea, the next wave arrived. At 09:30, Torpedo Squadron 6, VT-6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene E. Lindsay, appeared. They too had no fighter cover and faced the same wall of Zeros and flak. The result was a grim repeat. Lindsay was shot down and killed. 10 of 14 Devastators were blasted from the sky. The survivors managed to drop their torpedoes, but the wakes were easily avoided by the maneuvering Japanese carriers. The attacks were brave to the point of suicide, and wholly ineffective. On the bridges of the Japanese carriers, particularly on the flagship Akagi, the mood transformed from concern to triumphant contempt. The American attacks were being annihilated with ease. Admiral Nagumo and his staff watched the carnage with a growing sense of invulnerability. The rearming operation was nearing completion. Soon, a massive counterstrike of over 100 aircraft would be ready to launch and obliterate the American task force. The recovery of the Midway strike was finished. The flight decks, while crowded, were being rapidly organized. The danger seemed to be passing. The American torpedo planes, these slow, pathetic birds, had been swatted aside. Where were their dive bombers? Where were their fighters? The American tactics seemed disjointed, incompetent. The psychological strain on the American side was immense, the weight of failure crushing. On the Japanese side, confidence hardened into arrogance. They believed they had weathered the storm. The decisive moment of their launch was minutes away. The great counter-punch was coiled and ready to spring. All that was needed was to bring the ships fully into the wind and begin the launch. This belief in managed outcomes was a lethal illusion. The chaos of the American attack sequence, born of miscommunication and misfortune, was inadvertently creating the conditions for a miracle. The dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown were lost, circling, their fuel gauges dipping toward empty. The Hornet's dive bombers had missed the Japanese entirely and were flying on toward oblivion. The American battle plan was in tatters, but two critical elements were aligning in the blind spot of Japanese perception. First, the relentless, sacrificial attacks by the torpedo squadrons had pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level and had fixed the attention of the entire fleet on the low-altitude threat. The sky above 10,000 feet was empty. Second, the Japanese fleet, having finished recovering aircraft, was now steaming into the wind to the northeast to launch its own strike. This turn, intended to facilitate their own attack, had the unintended consequence of steadying their course, making them momentarily less maneuverable. It also placed the four carriers in a relatively compact formation, their white wake patterns painting perfect targets on the dark blue sea. High above, at 20,000 feet, two groups of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers were on the verge of abandoning their search. One group, bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Clarence W. McCluskey, had flown beyond their calculated intercept point and found nothing. Fuel was critical. McCluskey, a former fighter pilot with relentless determination, made a crucial choice. Instead of turning back, he decided to follow a last hunch, continuing his search on a northwest leg for a few more minutes. At 10, through a break in the clouds, he spotted the long, white, arrow-straight wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, which was speeding to rejoin the fleet after depth-charging an American submarine. McCluskey turned to follow the wake. It was a decision born of desperation and instinct, a gamble with the last of his squadron's fuel. The Arashi was leading him directly to the heart of the Japanese fleet. At virtually the same moment, the dive bombers from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell F. Leslie, having had a more accurate vector, arrived in the vicinity independently. As McCluskey's group neared the end of their fuel and hope, the sprawling spectacle of the Kido Butai was suddenly laid out beneath them like a scale model. There they were, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, ploughing through the sea, their decks crammed with rows of parked aircraft, fuel lines snaking across the wood, and stacks of bombs and torpedoes sitting unsecured in the open. Not a single Zero fighter circled above them. The sky was clear. It was, though no American pilot could have known it, the most vulnerable moment in the history of naval warfare. The irreversible consequence of Nagumo's decision to recover and rearm now presented itself as a tableau of perfect, oblivious targets. McCluskey keyed his microphone. The attack signal was given. The Dauntlesses nosed over into their near-vertical dives, the wind screaming through their perforated dive brakes. For the next 5 minutes, the entire trajectory of the Pacific War would hang in the balance of their aim. The dive of the Dauntless was a physical and psychological trial, a controlled plummet from celestial silence into the hellfire of the battlefield. As McCluskey's and Leslie's squadrons tipped over at 10:22, The world for the pilots collapsed into a narrow universe of wind noise, the screaming engine, the focused crosshairs of the telescopic sight, and the ship swelling rapidly in their vision. There was no broad view of the battle, only the singular, terrifying task of holding the dive, of ignoring the inevitable flak that would soon blossom around them, of adjusting the aim point until it was perfect. For perhaps 30 seconds they fell unmolested, a grace period granted by the Japanese fixation on the low-level threat. On the decks of the Japanese carriers, the first warning was not the scream of engines, but the frantic, pointing arms of lookouts who had finally glimpsed the small, dark specks materializing almost directly overhead. The cry of Kanko Bakuge Kiki, dive bombers, echoed across bridges with a tone of disbelief and dawning horror. The scene below was one of organized preparation instantly frozen into catastrophic vulnerability. On Akagi's flight deck, the strike force of Kate torpedo bombers, fully armed and fueled, were lined up for launch. On Kaga, the situation was even more congested, with aircraft parked fore and aft, and refueling and rearming operations in their final chaotic stages. The carriers began to twist and turn, but their size and the crowded decks made evasive action sluggish. The first bombs fell on Kaga. A 1,000-pound bomb from Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown group pierced the flight deck just aft of the island, exploding in the upper hangar among the parked and fueled aircraft. In rapid succession, 3 more bombs from McCluskey's Enterprise squadron struck with apocalyptic precision. One detonated directly among the clustered aircraft on the forward deck, creating an instantaneous firestorm that consumed planes, men, and equipment. Another smashed through the amidships elevator, blowing it into a twisted ruin and exploding deep within the ship's vitals. The fourth hit near the base of the island's superstructure, decapitating the command staff and severing fire main connections. Kaga, a floating city of over 2,000 men, was transformed in seconds into a roaring inferno. Black, oily smoke billowed thousands of feet into the sky. Secondary explosions, fuel tanks, oxygen tanks, ordnance, rippled through her structure as parked aircraft detonated like strings of firecrackers. Simultaneously, the flagship Akagi suffered a blow of seemingly surgical lethality. Of the many Dauntlesses diving on her, only 2 scored direct hits. But the placement was diabolical. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck the edge of the midship elevator, blowing it into the hangar and igniting the gases from fractured fuel lines. The second, and ultimately fatal, hit landed amid the lined-up torpedo bombers on the aft flight deck. These Kates, each armed with a live torpedo, became a chain of sympathetic detonations. The explosion ripped through the aft portion of the flight deck, hurling aircraft and debris into the air and sending a fireball racing forward. The ship's rudder was jammed hard over, locking Akagi in a wide, helpless turn. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge, was thrown to the deck by the concussions. The scene around him was one of surreal devastation. Fires raged out of control aft. The communication system was shattered. The ship's speed began to bleed away. Within minutes it was clear Akagi was doomed. The careful, prudent decisions of the past 2 hours had built a pyre, and the American dive bombers had simply provided the spark. The third carrier, Soryu, was attacked with equal fury by dive bombers from the Yorktown group. In the span of 3 minutes, she took 3 direct hits along her centerline. The bombs tore through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar where aircraft were being armed. The resulting fires were instantaneous and catastrophic, feeding on aviation fuel from ruptured lines and the fabric and magnesium of the aircraft themselves. The ship's internal sprinkler system was powerless against the torrent of flame. The engine rooms lost power. The helm became unresponsive. Soryu, engulfed from stem to stern, went dead in the water, a column of dense black smoke marking her funeral pyre. The shock aboard the Japanese ships was absolute, a physical and psychological paralysis. From the triumphant confidence of 10 minutes prior, the reality had inverted into a nightmare of unbelievable swiftness. On the bridge of the surviving carrier Hiryu, which had been somewhat separated from the main group, Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku received the reports with stoic calm, but the magnitude of the disaster was incomprehensible. 3 carriers, the heart of the Kido Butai, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were burning wrecks, their fate irreversible. The noise was a colossal orchestra of destruction, the roar of flames, the shriek of buckling metal, the thunderous cook-off of ammunition, and the terrible screams of the trapped and wounded. On the American side, the dive bomber pilots pulling out of their dives at masthead height could hardly believe their eyes. Through the smoke and chaos they saw the results of their work, fires of impossible scale, ships already listing. The radio chatter was a mix of exultation and stunned reporting. Scratch one flat top. Cargo is burning fiercely. The psychological strain of the morning's failures evaporated in the face of this unimaginable success. The long-form historian must note that this 5 minutes was not the product of flawless American planning, but a convergence of incredible luck, sacrificial bravery, and Japanese operational fragility. The truth that replaced the illusion was brutal. The invincible Kido Butai was mortally wounded. The entire strategic premise of the Japanese operation, the decisive battle of annihilation, had been upended in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. The initiative now passed irrevocably to the Americans, but the battle was far from over. 1 carrier, Hiryu, remained, and aboard her was a command team with a samurai's resolve and nothing left to lose. Amidst the swirling pillars of smoke that marked the graves of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the carrier Hiryu emerged as an island of desperate, furious resolve. Separated by several miles from the main concentration, she had escaped the initial dive-bombing cataclysm. On her bridge, Vice Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, a charismatic and aggressive commander often touted as a future Yamamoto, understood the situation with crystalline clarity. There was no thought of retreat, no consideration of preserving his ship. The code of Bushido and the sheer magnitude of the disaster demanded one response: retaliation. The honor of the combined fleet, and perhaps the entire nation, now rested on Hiryu's ability to strike back and destroy the American carrier force. While the other 3 carriers burned, Yamaguchi and his air officer began launching a strike with ruthless efficiency. He would not wait to assemble a massive, coordinated wave. He would hit the Americans quickly, in sequence, with whatever he could put into the air. At approximately 10:50, just as the scale of the disaster was becoming apparent, Hiryu turned into the wind and launched a first strike of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero escorts. They were guided by a skilled pilot who had seen the American force retreating to the northeast after the attack. The hunt was on. The American task forces, meanwhile, were in a state of cautious exultation. The returning pilots from McCluskey's and Leslie's squadrons reported spectacular success, though the exact number of carriers sunk was initially unclear. Aboard the Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher, now in sole command after Spruance, had manoeuvred the Enterprise and Hornet independently, understood the imperative to find and kill the 4th Japanese carrier. He launched a search of 10 SBD Dauntless scouts at 11 to fan out and locate the missing Hiryu, but the American forces, having just recovered their own aircraft and with flight decks bustling with activity, were also vulnerable. Fletcher, aware of this, had fighters circling combat air patrol. The psychological atmosphere was a complex mix of triumph and acute anxiety. They had drawn blood, a tremendous amount of it, but the predator was wounded, not dead. The long shadow of Japanese prowess still lingered. At 11:59, the Yorktown's radar picked up incoming bogies at 40 miles. The ship's alarm klaxon sounded, the piercing wail cutting through the humid air. The crew, who had been relishing the reports of victory, were instantly thrust back into the visceral reality of their own peril.
Fletcher ordered all available fighter planes vectored out to
intercept. The Yorktown began preparing for battle. Fueled aircraft were struck below. Fuel lines were drained and purged with inert carbon dioxide. Damage control parties stood ready, and the ship increased speed and began to maneuver. The sleek, patched-up carrier became a hive of disciplined activity. The combat air patrol of Wildcat fighters, directed by the radar and fighter direction officers, met the incoming Vals about 15 miles out. A fierce dogfight erupted in the sky. The Wildcats, though less agile than the Zeros, were rugged and well armed. They broke up the Japanese formation, shooting down several Vals, but a determined corps of about 8 dive bombers, escorted by a few Zeros, pressed on toward the Yorktown. At 12:10, the Vals began their attacks. The Yorktown's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, conned his ship through a series of violent, hard turns, the great hull heeling over as rudder went full to port or starboard, the screen of escorting cruisers and destroyers. Unleashed a barrage of anti-aircraft fire, filling the sky with black puffs of flak and the criss-crossing traces of automatic weapons. The dive bombers, professional and relentless, weathered the storm. 3 bombs found their mark. The first struck the flight deck near the number 2 elevator, exploding in the hangar and starting a severe fire. The second plunged through the flight deck and detonated deep within the ship's uptakes, rupturing the uptakes for 3 boilers and snuffing out their fires. Thick, acrid smoke poured through the engineering spaces, forcing the evacuation of the boiler rooms. The ship's speed plummeted from 30 knots to a mere 6. The third bomb hit the edge of the flight deck further aft, starting another fire. In moments, the Yorktown was burning, shrouded in smoke, and dead in the water. Yet here, the months of training and the lessons learned from the Pearl Harbor disaster bore fruit. The damage control parties aboard Yorktown were superbly trained and led. The fires, though fierce, were attacked with methodical fury. The ship's executive officer, Commander Dixie Kiefer, a man of immense physical strength and energy, seemed to be everywhere at once, directing crews and motivating men. The patched-up holes from Coral Sea held. Within an incredible 30 minutes, by 12:45, the fires were under control, and boiler crews wearing gas masks had relit the furnaces in the undamaged boilers. Power began to return, and the great ship began to move again, working her way up to 19 knots. The flag was still flying. The strike from Hiryu had hurt her badly, but it had not killed her. The crew's morale, tested in the furnace of Coral Sea and now again at Midway, proved unbreakable. However, she was wounded and vulnerable, her flight deck holed, her air group dispersed. Fletcher, recognizing she could no longer function effectively as a command platform, transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria at 13, signaling to Spruance that tactical command now passed to him. The baton was handed just as the second, more deadly strike from the tenacious Hiryu was being prepared. Even as the Yorktown fought for her life, the search aircraft she had launched were scouring the western horizon. At 13:30, an SBD Dauntless Scout piloted by Lieutenant Samuel Adams, operating from the Yorktown but now homing in on the American fleet, radioed a contact report of breathtaking importance. He had found the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, along with supporting ships, approximately 110 miles to the northwest. The report was immediately relayed to Admiral Spruance on the Enterprise. The moment of decision had arrived. Spruance, the calm, calculating chess master, now held the entire American counter-offensive in his hands. He had to weigh multiple factors. His own air groups were in disarray, having just landed after the morning strike in the defense of Yorktown. Aircraft needed to be rearmed, refueled, and respotted. Pilots were exhausted. The Hornet's air group was particularly scattered, many of its aircraft having been lost or misdirected during the morning's confused actions. To launch an immediate strike would be piecemeal and risky. To delay would give Hiryu time to launch yet another attack, potentially finding the American carriers in their own vulnerable recovery cycles. Spruance's character, a blend of intellectual rigor and deep-seated resolve, dictated his choice. He understood that the paramount objective was the destruction of the last Japanese carrier. Preservation of his own force was critical, but so was seizing the moment when the enemy's location was known. He would not repeat Nagumo's mistake of being caught in transition. He would launch a concerted massed strike even if it took time to organize. He gave the order, prepare every available dive bomber for a late afternoon launch. The Enterprise and Hornet became frenetic workshops, ordnance crews sweating in the tropical heat. Below decks, hauled 1,000-pound bombs and attached them to aircraft. Fueling crews pumped aviation gas. Flight deck directors orchestrated the delicate ballet of spotting aircraft for launch. The pilots, many of whom had already flown one grueling mission, were briefed. The target was Hiryu. This strike would be the knockout blow. While Spruance prepared his hammer blow, Hiryu was launching hers. At 13:31, even as Adams's contact report was being decoded, the second Japanese strike took off. 10 Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. This force was smaller but potentially more lethal, aiming to finish off the wounded American carrier they believed they had crippled. Led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who was flying with a fuel tank punctured during the morning strike, a certain death sentence, the group embodied the fatalistic determination of the Japanese at this juncture. They flew east, guided by earlier reports. At 14:30 they found not one, but what appeared to be 2 undamaged American carriers. Enterprise and Hornet were operating close together. Choosing the closer target, which they mistakenly identified as a different undamaged carrier, they focused their attack. In reality, it was the Yorktown, now underway again and having repaired her flight deck enough to resume air operations. Her radar picked up the incoming threat once more. Another frantic scramble ensued. The few remaining fighters of her combat air patrol, supplemented by planes from the other carriers, rose to intercept. Again the Wildcats tore into the formation, but the Kates, flying low and steady, pressed on through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. This time, the attack was executed with chilling precision. The Kates split into 2 groups for an anvil attack, forcing the Yorktown to choose which threat to turn away from. Captain Buckmaster maneuvered desperately, but at 14:42, 2 Type 91 torpedoes slammed into the carrier's port side in quick succession. The massive underwater explosions ripped open the hull, flooding the forward engine room and auxiliary boiler room. The rudder jammed. Electrical power failed across vast sections of the ship. With the list quickly increasing to 26 degrees, the Yorktown was dying. The great ship heeled over, her flight deck tilting toward the sea, seawater lapping over the port edge. The list was so severe that further damage control or flight operations were impossible. At 15, Captain Buckmaster, with a heavy heart, gave the order to abandon ship. The crew, disciplined to the end, took to the water or prepared life rafts, leaving their beloved ship a ghostly, listing hulk. The Hiryu had achieved a remarkable counterpunch, avenging her sisters by apparently sinking an American fleet carrier. But in doing so, she had revealed her position for the final time and consumed her last defensive strength. Her flight deck was now empty of strike aircraft. She had one last punch left, a handful of fighters for defense, and a few aircraft in reserve. She was a boxer who had thrown every knockout blow, now standing exhausted and exposed, awaiting the return shot she knew must come. That return shot was already in the air. At 15:30, Spruance launched his decisive strike. 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, including 10 orphaned Yorktown SBDs that had landed aboard, and 16 from the Hornet. They flew westward into the lowering afternoon sun. The leader of the Enterprise group, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, was again in the air, though wounded from the morning's action. The flight was a long, tense haul, the pilots anxious about finding the target before dusk.
At 16:45, they spotted their prey. The Hiryu, surrounded by her escorts, was making high speed, but her flight deck was conspicuously empty. She had just recovered her few remaining fighters and the surviving aircraft from the second strike. She was, for a fleeting moment, in a state of recovery, her decks
potentially vulnerable. The American dive bombers had no fighter escort, but they also faced a minimal combat air patrol. Hiryu's few remaining Zeros were low on fuel and ammunition. The Dauntlesses nosed over into their dives at 17. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns opened up, and the handful of Zeros rose bravely to intercept, but it was too little, too late. 4 1,000-pound bombs found their mark on the forward flight deck of the Hiryu. The explosions were catastrophic, blowing the forward elevator back against the island and creating an inferno among the parked aircraft. Fires raged out of control. By nightfall, Hiryu, like her sisters, was a floating crematorium, her engines dead, her fate sealed. The fourth and final Japanese fleet carrier of the Kido Butai had been mortally wounded. As dusk settled over the Pacific on June 4th, the immediate fallout of the day's carnage was a landscape of profound, surreal dislocation. The sea, once an empty expanse, was now dotted with the terrible monuments of battle, the burning hulks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, their internal fires painting the gathering twilight an eerie orange. Around them, their screening ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, milled like bewildered attendants at a funeral, attempting rescue operations, fighting fires, or standing guard against an expected submarine attack that never came in force. The air was thick with the smells of burned fuel, cordite, and an even more sinister odour that rescue sailors would never forget. On the Japanese ships, the psychological strain transmuted into a silent, collective shock. The unthinkable had happened. The invincible Kido Butai, the very symbol of Japan's naval supremacy and the instrument of its destiny, was gone. Aboard the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto and his staff received the fragmentary, incredulous reports throughout the afternoon and evening. The initial disbelief gave way to a grim, heavy reality. Yamamoto, the master gambler, saw his entire strategic design collapse. There would be no decisive battle, no negotiated peace. The dream of the Kantai Kessen died with the carriers. His immediate instinctive reaction was to gather his scattered surface forces, the mighty main body including Yamato, the invasion force, the close support group, and steam toward the enemy for a night surface engagement, a last desperate throw of the dice to salvage something from the wreckage through gunnery. But the American carriers, under Spruance's cautious command, had prudently withdrawn to the east. The distance was too great. The night passed in a frantic, futile rush toward an enemy that was no longer there. On the American side, the atmosphere was one of exhausted, disbelieving triumph, tempered by acute loss and continued anxiety. The crews of Enterprise and Hornet, having recovered the strike that killed Hiryu, knew they had achieved something monumental, yet they also knew the Yorktown was gravely wounded and abandoned. The sea was filled with their own survivors as well. Admiral Spruance, now in full command, faced critical decisions. He had won an incredible defensive victory, but his primary duty was the preservation of his 2 remaining carriers. He rejected any notion of a reckless pursuit westward into the night, into the potential range of Yamamoto's battleships and the unknown positions of other Japanese forces. He turned east, away from the enemy, to rendezvous with Yorktown's escorts and to position himself to cover Midway from any renewed advance. It was a decision that would later be debated, but was, in the moment, a masterpiece of restraint, denying Yamamoto the night battle he craved. The American forces licked their wounds in the darkness, their crews catching a few hours of fitful sleep amid the adrenaline crash, the deck still vibrating from the day's operations. The human cost began to crystallize in the cold water. For the Japanese, the scale of loss was apocalyptic, The 4 carriers took over 3,000 officers and men to the bottom with them, including hundreds of the irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircrew who'd been the cutting edge of the Navy. The survivors in the water faced a horrific ordeal. Some were picked up by destroyers, but many were left behind as the Japanese fleet, fearing further air attacks, eventually withdrew westward. For the Americans, the toll was heavy but focused. The torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated. Of 41 devastators sent, only 6 returned. The sacrifice of VT-8, VT-6 and VT-3 from Yorktown was near total. The dive bomber and fighter squadrons had also suffered significant losses. And then there was the Yorktown. Her crew, having performed miracles to save her once, now watched from the water or from escorting destroyers as their beloved ship, pride of the pre-war Navy, listed ominously under the stars. A salvage party would reboard her the next day, a story of its own drama, but for now, she was a silent, dying giant. The long-term impact of the day's events, though not yet fully graspable, cast its first shadows. The balance of power in the Pacific had not just shifted, it had undergone a seismic inversion. In a single day, Japan lost its strategic offensive capability. The initiative, wrested from the Americans at Pearl Harbor, was now forcefully and permanently returned. The Japanese Navy, while still powerful in surface vessels, had lost its principal striking arm and, more importantly, the aura of invincibility that was its greatest psychological weapon. The American industrial advantage, which Yamamoto had feared, now became the dominant factor of the war. The United States could replace lost ships and aircraft. Japan, its pilot training pipeline already strained, could not. The Battle of Midway as a discrete event was effectively over by nightfall on June 4th, though the aftershocks, the sinking of the Yorktown and the Japanese cruisers, Mikuma and Megami in a subsequent collision and air attack would continue for 2 more days. But the decisive act had been played out in those few minutes of dive bombing and the desperate answering strikes from Hiryu. In the quiet of the command bridges, men confronted the outcomes of their actions. Nagumo, transferred from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, was a broken man, presiding over the greatest naval defeat in his nation's history. Yamamoto, stoic and introspective, assumed full responsibility, his mind already turning to the grim defensive war that now awaited. On the American side, Nimitz in Pearl Harbor received the reports with profound gratitude and relief. His trust in Rochefort and his commanders vindicated 1,000-fold. Spruance, the quiet victor, began the meticulous process of assessing his forces and planning the next move, his calm unshaken. The characters, from the lowest ordnance man to the fleet admirals, were irrevocably altered. They had passed through a furnace of chance, bravery, and error, and emerged into a different world. The memory of this day, June 4th, 1942, would be etched not just into the histories, but into the very DNA of their respective navies. For one, a foundation myth of miraculous deliverance and rising power. For the other, a trauma of hubris and catastrophic loss, to be concealed, studied, and mourned in secret for a generation. The enduring significance was immediate. The course of the Pacific War had been permanently altered. The Japanese advance was halted. The road to Tokyo, though long and bloody, was now open. The silence that fell over the battlefield that night was not the silence of conclusion, but the deep, resonant quiet after the earth has moved and the landscape, forever changed, waits for the dawn. The dawn of June 5th broke over a Pacific shrouded in smoke and grief. The rising sun, the very symbol emblazoned on the flags of the retreating Japanese fleet, illuminated a scene of utter desolation. The great carriers were gone, sunk in the night by their own escorting destroyers after the last survivors and the Emperor's portrait had been removed. Kaga and Soryu had vanished beneath the waves before midnight. Akagi, the proud flagship, lingered until dawn, when a final spread of torpedoes from her loyal destroyers sent her to the deep. Hiryu, stubborn to the end, burned until just after sunrise, her magazine finally detonating in a final violent convulsion before she slipped under. The sea was littered with flotsam, charred life rafts, empty shell casings, pieces of aircraft, and a sinister spreading oil slick that painted the blue water iridescent black. For the Japanese, the immediate fallout was a paralyzing cocktail of disbelief, shame, and a desperate clawing need to mitigate the disaster. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the Yamato, had called off his charge toward the American fleet in the early hours, the distance too great, the risk of daylight air attack. From the still unknown number of American carriers now too severe. The combined fleet, its center vaporized, began a general, disorganized withdrawal to the west. The invasion force for Midway, its purpose now not just obsolete but suicidal, was ordered to reverse course. The Aleutians' diversion, now a hollow and expensive sideshow, was all that remained of the grand offensive. But the battle was not yet complete. Two separate, tragic dramas continued to unfold, each a coda to the main cataclysm. The first concerned the American carrier Yorktown. Abandoned and listing heavily, she had not sunk during the night. In the morning light she was still afloat, a ghost ship riding low but stubbornly clinging to life. A patrol plane sighted her and the report reached Admiral Spruance. To him, and to Admiral Fletcher, who watched from the cruiser Astoria, the Yorktown represented more than a piece of naval hardware. She was a symbol of resilience, a veteran of Coral Sea and Midway, a ship, saved once by sheer will. The decision was made. She would be saved. A salvage party of 170 volunteers, led by the indefatigable Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander John Delaney, was dispatched from the escorting destroyer Hammond. They reboarded the carrier at noon on the 5th. The scene that greeted them was one of eerie, tilted silence. The great hangar deck was a cavern of shadows, water sloshing against the port bulkheads. Tools and debris floated in the oily water. The smell of fuel, fire, and seawater was overpowering. The men set to work with a determined fury. They jettisoned loose gear and topside weight to correct the list. They patched holes, restored auxiliary power, and began pumping out the thousands of tons of seawater that flooded her compartments. By nightfall they were making progress. The list had decreased slightly. A flicker of hope, irrational and powerful, took hold. Tugs were summoned from Pearl Harbor, over 1,000 miles away. The plan was to tow her home, to repair her once more, to return her to the fight. It was a testament to the American capacity for recovery, a stubborn refusal to accept loss. The second drama involved the Japanese heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami. Part of the close support group tasked with bombarding Midway, they had been ordered to retire westward after the carrier debacle. In the pitch darkness of the early hours of June 5th, steaming at high speed and under strict radio silence, they attempted to avoid an American submarine contact. In the confusion, Mogami, leading, made a sudden turn. Mikuma, following too closely, could not react in time. With a horrific grinding shriek of tearing metal, Mikuma rammed Mogami's port quarter. The collision was catastrophic. Mogami's bow was crushed back almost to her forward turret. Mikuma suffered grievous damage to her port fuel tanks and her speed was reduced. They were now cripples, limping westward at a painfully slow pace, trailing a massive oil slick that painted a perfect arrow on the ocean pointing directly to them. Their misfortune was a final cruel gift to the Americans, a tangible target upon which to vent the remaining aggressive energy of the dive bomber squadrons and to solidify the victory. On June 6th, the American carriers, having swung back to the west to maintain pressure, found them. Scout planes reported the two wounded cruisers along with two escorting destroyers struggling to escape. For the American air groups, it was a chance at a clean-up action, a less deadly target than the dreaded carriers. From the decks of Enterprise and Hornet, wave after wave of SBD Dauntlesses took off.
The attacks that followed were relentless, a practiced slaughter. The cruisers, lacking air cover and hampered by their damage, could only twist and turn as the bombs fell. Mogami, though her forward section was a ruin, proved astonishingly resilient. Her damage control teams performed heroically, fighting fires and shoring up bulkheads. But Makuma, already bleeding fuel from her ruptured tanks, was less fortunate. Several direct hits set her ablaze from stem to stern. The fires reached her torpedo tubes, and the resulting secondary explosion was cataclysmic, tearing the ship apart. She sank later that afternoon, taking most of her crew with her. Mogami, a floating wreck, somehow survived the day's onslaught and limped away, a testament to Japanese engineering and sacrifice, but a cripple that would take years to repair. The sinking of Makuma and the mauling of Mogami were the final emphatic punctuation marks on the battle. The victory was no longer just defensive, it was now a rout, an unambiguous pursuit and destruction of the fleeing enemy. Yet even as this action concluded, the other tragedy reached its climax. The Yorktown, under tow by the minesweeper Vireo, was making slow, painful progress. The salvage crew had performed near miracles and the ship seemed stable. Then, at 13:30 on June 6, the Japanese submarine I-1688, which had stalked the area for days, found its opportunity. Sliding past the screen of destroyers, it fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. One missed. One passed directly under the destroyer Hammond, which was tied alongside Yorktown providing power, and struck the carrier. The other 2 hit Hammond squarely in the ammunition magazine. The little destroyer exploded, broke in 2, and sank in minutes, taking many of her crew and several of the Yorktown salvage party with her. The torpedo that hit Yorktown tore a new, fatal hole in her starboard side. The valiant work of the salvage crew was undone in an instant. Flooding resumed, inexorable and unstoppable. Throughout the night of June 6th and into the morning of the 7th, the Yorktown slowly gave up her fight. At 07001 on June 7th, she rolled over onto her port side and sank in 3,000 fathoms of water, her battle flags flying. Her loss was a deep, painful sting amidst the overwhelming victory, a reminder that in war, even triumph is paid for in blood and steel. The ocean that had witnessed the death of 4 Japanese carriers now claimed an American queen, closing the circle of destruction. In the wake of the physical destruction came a more subtle, profound fallout, the psychological and strategic reckoning within the minds of the commanders. The characters who had orchestrated and executed the battle now stood amidst the ruins of their plans and assumptions, forced to confront the outcomes of their actions with a stark, unforgiving clarity. For Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor, the news that solidified through June 5th and 6th brought a profound, quiet relief, but one tempered by the loss of Yorktown and her men. His calculated risks, backing Rochefort's intuition, repairing Yorktown in 3 days, placing trust in the untested Spruance, had been vindicated beyond his wildest hopes. Yet his demeanour did not change to jubilation. In a famous moment when handed a preliminary victory, dispatch, he simply nodded and said, "Well, we have won a great victory. Let's not claim too much credit. Our intelligence was superb and our officers and men were brave and resourceful." His reflection was immediately forward-looking. The victory was not an end, but a beginning, the opening of a door that had been slammed shut at Pearl Harbor. He understood the long-term impact instantly. The initiative had passed to the United States. His task now was to exploit it, to prevent the Japanese from recovering their balance, to begin the long, hard road of the offensive. For Admiral Raymond Spruance, the victor of the battle, the immediate aftermath was a period of intense solitary assessment. Aboard the Enterprise, he received the reports of the cruiser strikes and the loss of Yorktown with his characteristic calm. He was already analysing his own decisions, particularly his choice to withdraw eastward on the night of June 4th, forsaking a potential night action. The criticism from some of his more aggressive staff officers was a murmur in the background, Spruance, however, was secure in his reasoning. He had prioritized the preservation of his carriers, the instruments of future victory, over the uncertain gains of a frantic night chase. His command had been a masterclass in the calculated risk Nimitz had prescribed. He had been aggressive when it mattered, launching the fateful morning strike early, and conservative when necessary. The outcome justified his judgment, but he took no visible pride in it. The victory belonged to the pilots who dove through flak, the torpedo squadrons who sacrificed themselves, and the damage control parties who fought fires. His confrontation with the outcome was one of sober responsibility, a recognition that the mantle of leadership in the Pacific now rested more heavily upon his shoulders. On the Japanese side, the confrontation was an exercise in agony. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, on the Yamato, absorbed the full, horrific scope of the defeat as confirmed reports trickled in. The ambitious gambler had lost his greatest wager. The man who feared a long war now saw its grim spectre materialize with terrifying certainty. He assumed total responsibility, as was expected, drafting a formal apology to the Emperor. But his introspection went deeper than ritual. He knew the flaw lay not merely in execution, but in the plan itself, its complexity, its arrogance, its dilution of force. The hidden tensions and rivalries that had birthed the compromised operation now seemed like fatal cancers. His relationship with the Naval General Staff, already strained, would become a chasm of mutual recrimination. Yet, in the immediate aftermath, his primary concern was to salvage the fleet and the morale of the nation. He enforced a draconian veil of secrecy. The truth of the disaster was to be concealed at all costs. The public, and even much of the lower ranks of the Navy, would be told a version of events that spoke of a great victory, though one bought at heavy cost, with one American carrier sunk and one Japanese carrier lost. The survivors from the sunken carriers were isolated, sworn to silence, and dispersed to distant postings to prevent the truth from spreading. Yamamoto's confrontation was thus twofold: an internal admission of catastrophic failure, and an external commitment to a monumental lie, a psychological burden that would weigh on him until his death the following year. For Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, transferred to the cruiser Nagara, the confrontation was with personal and professional ruin. The cautious, dependable commander had been at the epicenter of the disaster. His series of logical, prudent decisions had led to apocalyptic results. The critique of his hesitation, his failure to launch an immediate strike upon discovering the American carriers, would haunt him and define his historical legacy. In the moment, he was a shattered figure, presiding over the remnants of his once proud command. The aggressive air officers like Genda and the wounded Fuchida, who had urged bold action, now endured their own private hells of validation and despair. They had been right, and being right felt like ashes. The entire Kido Butai staff was traumatized, their confidence in their own doctrine and invincibility annihilated. They retreated westward not just from the Americans, but from their own past selves. The junior officers and enlisted men on both sides faced their own reckonings. For the American sailors and airmen, there was a dazed sense of having survived something immense. The torpedo squadron survivors, like Ensign George Gay, who was rescued after 30 hours in the water, became living witnesses to the sacrifice. The dive bomber pilots, the aces in a day, grappled with sudden fame and the memory of the hellish fires they had ignited. The loss of so many friends in the torpedo squadrons tempered any celebration. Aboard the Japanese destroyers, the sailors tasked with rescuing survivors from the burning carriers pulled men from the oil-slicked sea who were burned, delirious, or in catatonic shock. They listened to the stories of the attacks, of the infernos on the flight decks, and they began to understand, in their guts, that something fundamental had changed. The long-term impact on these individuals was the forging of a new reality. For the Americans,
a hard-won confidence that the Japanese could be beaten. For the Japanese, a secret gnawing knowledge that they were not invincible, a knowledge that had to be buried beneath a facade of discipline and imperial resolve. The battle had ended, but the process of confronting its meaning for every man from admiral to seaman had just begun. The long-term impact of the Battle of Midway on the systems, strategies, and material realities of the Pacific War was immediate, profound, and irreversible. In the grand strategic calculus, the battle represented the point of culmination for Japanese expansion. The tide of conquest, which had flowed unchecked for 6 months, crested at Midway and now began its permanent ebb. The initiative passed decisively and permanently to the United States. Within weeks, American planners in Washington and Pearl Harbor were shifting from desperate defense to deliberate offense. The first major manifestation was Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, launched barely 8 weeks later in August 1942. This bold, if initially chaotic offensive would have been unthinkable without the victory at Midway. The Japanese, stripped of their carrier supremacy and their strategic initiative, were forced into a reactive, defensive posture for the remainder of the war, fighting a grinding war of attrition they were destined to lose. The material impact was staggeringly one-sided. Japan's loss of 4 frontline fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and their elite veteran air groups was a blow from which the Imperial Navy never recovered. These were not just ships. They were the repository of Japan's pre-war naval aviation expertise. The pilots and aircrew lost, the men who had trained for a decade and honed their skills over Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, and the Indian Ocean, were irreplaceable. The Japanese pilot training pipeline, already rigorous and lengthy, could not produce quality replacements at the rate of loss. The skill level of Japanese carrier aviation would henceforth decline steadily. In contrast, the United States lost 1 fleet carrier, Yorktown, a destroyer, Hammond, and about 150 aircraft. While the loss of the veteran torpedo squadron pilots was a severe blow, the American training system was massive, flexible, and would soon be producing competent aviators in overwhelming numbers. The American industrial juggernaut, which Yamamoto had feared, now swung into full, terrifying motion. New Essex-class carriers, larger and more capable than anything Japan could build, were already sliding down the ways. The system of American production and manpower would only widen the gap Midway had created. Doctrinally, the battle was the final, unequivocal verdict on the primacy of the aircraft carrier. The mighty battleships, the Yamato and Musashi, the largest ever built, had been reduced to spectators, useless in the decisive engagement. The era of the battle line was over. Future naval combat would be conducted at ranges of hundreds of miles by aircraft launched from floating airfields. This lesson was absorbed instantly by the US Navy and reluctantly, but inevitably, by the Japanese. The battle also validated the importance of intelligence, radar, and damage control. The American advantage in radar and fighter direction, while primitive, had been crucial. The superior American damage control techniques, born from the lessons of Pearl Harbor, had saved countless lives and would save many ships in future battles. The Japanese, whose warship design often prioritized offensive power over defensive resilience and damage control, saw the catastrophic cost of that philosophy in the fuel and ordnance infernos that consumed their carriers. Within the respective navies, the battle triggered seismic shifts in command and culture. In Japan, the defeat was so shattering that it could not be openly addressed. The culture of face-saving and the authoritarian structure prevented a thorough, honest post-mortem. Blame was diffused, lessons were obscured by the need to maintain the facade of ultimate victory. This institutional failure to learn from the disaster would lead to further catastrophic errors in judgment at the battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, and ultimately at the Philippine Sea. The aggressive, offensive spirit that had served so well in the opening months now became a dangerous liability,
leading to reckless attacks without the necessary resources or reconnaissance. In America, the victory bred a powerful but not
uncritical confidence. The Midway luck was celebrated, but men like Nimitz and Spruance understood the role of preparation, intelligence, and sound decision-making. The US Navy's culture became one of learning and adaptation, embracing new technologies and tactics. The partnership between intelligence operators like Rochefort and fleet commanders was strengthened, setting a pattern for the rest of the war. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on the psychological landscape of the war. For the American public, Midway arrived as the first unalloyed good news of the Pacific War. The Doolittle raid in April had been a morale boost, but a symbolic one. Midway was a concrete, decisive victory. It transformed the national mood from one of anxious defense and thirst for revenge into a belief in eventual victory. It vindicated the leadership and gave the nation a set of new heroes: the dive bomber pilots, the doomed torpedo squadrons, the steadfast Spruance. For Japan, the psychological impact was the exact opposite, though hidden from the populace. The senior leadership, from Yamamoto down, understood that the war was now unwinnable in any traditional sense. The dream of a negotiated peace from a position of strength evaporated. The strategy shifted to one of inflicting such heavy casualties on the advancing Americans that they would lose the will to fight, a strategy of attritional despair that would culminate in the suicidal defenses of Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Midway planted the seed of a desperate, fatalistic resolve that would define Japan's conduct for the rest of the conflict. The systems of two nations, one built on transparency, industrial mass, and adaptive learning, the other on secrecy, ritual, and inflexible doctrine, had clashed at a point in the Central Pacific. The collision revealed the inherent weaknesses of one and the latent strengths of the other, setting the trajectory for everything that followed. The long-term impact was not just a change in the map, but a change in the very momentum of history, a confirmation that the vast impersonal forces of industrial production and democratic resilience would overcome the focused, brittle intensity of the militarist state. The enduring significance of Midway extends far beyond the tactical details of bomb hits and sinking ships. It resides in the realm of myth, memory, and the fragile architecture of historical chance. The battle immediately entered the American consciousness as a miracle, a term used by contemporaries and historians alike. This framing was not merely celebratory, it captured the genuine sense of a deliverance achieved against overwhelming odds through a confluence of bravery, intelligence, and fortuitous timing that felt providential. The story of Rochefort's code-breaking and the water distillation ruse became a foundational legend of the brilliance behind the scenes. The sacrificial charge of the torpedo, squadrons, particularly Torpedo 8, was immortalized as the ultimate embodiment of courage, a deliberate self-sacrifice that inadvertently cleared the path for victory. The 5 minutes that changed the war narrative, focusing on the dive bomber's arrival at the precise moment of Japanese vulnerability, took on the quality of a fable, a dramatic turning point where fate hinged on a handful of seconds. This mythologization served a vital national purpose. It provided a clean, heroic narrative to counter the chaos and shame of Pearl Harbor, a creation myth for the American triumph in the Pacific. In Japan, the memory of Midway was forced underground, sculpted by the state into a palatable falsehood. The public was told of a great victory, the capture of the Aleutians, a factual but strategically meaningless event, and the sinking of 2 American carriers, partially true counting Yorktown. The catastrophic loss of their own carriers was explained away as severe damage, with the ships subsequently retired or lost in later, unnamed actions. The survivors were silenced. This official narrative created a schizophrenic memory, a public myth of continued success and a private, painful truth known only to the highest echelons of the Navy and the thousands of grieving families who received vague notices of their sons' deaths. This deliberate obfuscation had lasting consequences. It prevented an honest national reckoning with the defeat, allowing the war to continue for 3 more brutal years under a cloud of delusion about Japanese capabilities and the true strategic situation. The enduring significance for Japan was thus a trauma twice over: the material loss and the psychological burden of carrying a state-mandated lie. For the craft of history and military strategy, Midway endures as the classic case study in the decisive battle, the volatility of complex operations, and the role of chance in human affairs. Military academies have dissected it for decades, examining the chain of decisions: Nagumo's hesitation, Spruance's early launch, McCluskey's fateful turn to follow the Arashi's wake. It is a masterclass in what the Prussian theorist Karl von Clausewitz called friction, the myriad of small, unforeseen events that grind away at the most perfect plan. The Japanese plan was a masterpiece on paper, but it shattered upon contact with the independent will of the enemy, imperfect weather, delayed reconnaissance, and the simple human difficulty of managing a fleet under attack. The battle demonstrates the paradox of strategic design. The more complex and synchronized a plan, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. Yamamoto's intricate trap required a dozen moving parts to function in harmony. The American response, built on a simple directive of find and attack the carriers, was robust in its flexibility. The battle also underscores the transformative power of intelligence. Midway stands as arguably the greatest intelligence victory in modern naval history. The work of Rochefort and his team did not just provide an advantage, it fundamentally altered the nature of the engagement, transforming an American defensive reaction into a prepared counter-ambush. It validated the idea that wars could be won not only on battlefields but in windowless rooms filled with analysts and cryptographers. This lesson resonated through the Cold War and into the modern era, elevating signals intelligence to a central pillar of national strategy. On a human level, the enduring significance lies in the individual stories of choice under extreme pressure. The battle is a mosaic of such moments. Ensign George Gay choosing to play dead in the water amidst the enemy fleet, Lieutenant Richard Best of Enterprise deciding to break off from the attack on Kaga to instead target Akagi, a decision that likely doomed the flagship, Captain Buckmaster's agonizing order to abandon Yorktown, the Hiryu's aircrew, launching their final strikes knowing they lack the fuel to return. These moments, compressed in time and magnified by consequence, reveal character in its rawest form. They remind us that history's great tides are turned by individuals making decisions in real time with imperfect information, driven by duty, fear, courage, and sometimes simple instinct. Finally, Midway endures as a symbol of strategic reversal. It is the archetypal turning point. In the vast narrative of the Second World War, it marks the precise hinge where the Axis advance ceased and the Allied counter-offensive began. It is the Pacific counterpart to Stalingrad and El Alamein, battles fought within weeks of each other in 1942 that collectively broke the momentum of the Tripartite Pact. Its significance is thus global. By ensuring the Pacific would be an American, not a Japanese, sphere of influence for the remainder of the war and the post-war settlement, Midway shaped the geopolitical map of the late 20th century. It ensured that the United States would emerge as the dominant Pacific power, a reality that has defined the region's economics, diplomacy, and security architecture ever since. The echoes of those 5 minutes in June 1942 still reverberate in the strategic calculations of nations, a permanent testament to how quickly fortune can change and how decisively a single battle can alter the destiny of the world. As the smoke cleared and the fleets retreated to their respective bases,
The process of absorbing the lessons and constructing the legacies of Midway began in earnest, a process marked by sharp contrast between victor and vanquished. In Pearl Harbor and Washington, the analysis was swift, clinical, and forward-looking. Admiral Nimitz initiated a comprehensive after-action review, gathering reports from every task force commander, every squadron leader, every surviving pilot. The findings were clear. The Dauntless dive bomber was a war winner, but it needed fighter escort. The Devastator torpedo bomber was obsolete and had to be replaced immediately. The faster, tougher TBF Avenger was already entering service. Fighter direction, while better than the Japanese non-existent system, needed radical improvement. Most importantly, the Carrier Task Force doctrine, with integrated rings of cruisers and destroyers for anti-aircraft defense, was validated and would be refined into the primary instrument of Pacific power projection. The victory was not seen as an endpoint, but as a license to accelerate. The building programs were expanded, training intensified, and the planning for the Solomons campaign moved from the speculative to the operational. The legacy for the Americans was one of confidence earned, not given, a confidence that would be tested severely in the bloody morass of Guadalcanal just months later, but which would never again be fully extinguished. For the Japanese combined fleet, the post-mortem was shrouded in silence and shame. Aboard the Yamato, Yamamoto and his staff conducted their own review, but its conclusions were filtered through the need to preserve the honor of the service and to maintain the deception for the emperor and the public. The official report to Tokyo was a masterpiece of omission and euphemism. It spoke of tactical setbacks and severe damage to several carriers, blaming unforeseen enemy carrier presence and unfortunate conflagrations. The critical failures in reconnaissance, the rigidity of the rearming schedule, the fatal dispersal of forces were not subjected to the blistering critique they deserved. To do so would have required indicting the core planning assumptions of the Navy itself and the authority of Yamamoto. Instead, the lessons were absorbed as tactical tweaks: the need for better scout planes, improved anti-aircraft drills, more robust damage control. The deeper doctrinal lesson, the fallacy of complex plans, the danger of underestimating the enemy's resilience and intelligence capability, was missed. The legacy for the Japanese Navy was thus one of unresolved trauma. The defeat was a ghost that haunted the fleet, a secret failure that festered beneath a veneer of continued discipline. It bred not constructive adaptation, but a deepening fatalism and a turn toward even more desperate measures, like the reckless expenditure of air groups in attritional battles and the rise of the kamikaze tactic, which can be seen as a spiritual descendant of the suicidal determination displayed at Midway, a willingness to trade life for a chance to strike a blow, born from the knowledge that victory in a contest of skill and production was no longer possible. The personal legacies of the key actors were irrevocably shaped by the battle. Chester Nimitz's reputation was cemented as the unflappable architect of Pacific victory. He would go on to command the theatre through its triumphant conclusion, his authority now unquestioned. Raymond Spruance emerged from the shadow of the hospitalized Halsey as the strategic genius of the First Order, a commander whose intellect and calm would define the Spruance style of careful, overwhelming advance that characterized the Central Pacific Drive. He would lead the Fifth Fleet to victory at the Philippine Sea and provide the naval umbrella for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Frank Jack Fletcher, despite his crucial role, saw his legacy somewhat tarnished by the loss of Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway, fair or not, and he would move to less central commands. Joseph Rochefort, the intelligence savant, became a legend, though his wartime career was ironically cut short by the very bureaucratic rivals in Washington who had doubted him. He was reassigned, a victim of his own success and the jealousy it provoked. On the Japanese side, Isoroku Yamamoto's legacy became tragically bifurcated. He remained the revered, brilliant commander-in-chief, but the defeat at Midway marked the end of his offensive vision.
He spent the remaining 9 months of his life overseeing a defensive war he knew was hopeless. His death in April 1943, when American fighters ambushed and shot down his transport plane based on decrypted itinerary information, a cruel echo of the intelligence coup at Midway, cemented his status as a martyred hero, shielding his reputation from deeper post-war scrutiny of his strategic errors. Chuichi Nagumo's legacy was fixed as the cautious commander who lost the carriers. He was given lesser commands, eventually ending up as the commander of the defences on Saipan, where he committed suicide during the American invasion in 1944, a final grim association with catastrophic defeat. The younger aggressive minds like Minoru Genda survived the war, their talents frustrated, and would go on to help found the post-war Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, applying the hard lessons of Midway to a new era. For the world at large, the legacy of Midway is the legacy of the Pacific War's turning point. It is remembered as the moment the United States stepped onto the path of global superpower status. The victory ensured that the post-war order in Asia would be shaped primarily by American, not Japanese imperatives. It saved Australia and New Zealand from imminent threat, preserved Hawaii as a base, and allowed the United States to fight a one-front naval war, concentrating its immense resources first against Germany and Europe while holding Japan in check. The battle's meaning endures in the collective memory as a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of intelligence, and the breathtaking speed with which fortune can change in modern warfare. It stands as a permanent warning against the hubris of believing in invincibility, and a timeless example of how courage, even in the face of certain death, can shape history. The quiet atoll of Midway, today a bird sanctuary, is a silent guardian of these memories, its sandy shores and lagoon holding the secrets of the deep where titans rest. The battle fought over it in June 1942 was more than a clash of fleets. It was a vortex that swallowed one vision of empire and propelled another toward dawn, its legacy not merely written in history books, but etched into the geopolitical DNA of the modern world. The withdrawal of the Japanese combined fleet from the vicinity of Midway was not a maneuver of war but a funeral procession. A profound and shattering silence descended upon the force, a silence more oppressive than any barrage of gunfire. It was the silence of disbelief, of shame so deep it stifled speech, of a future collapsing inward. Aboard the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto maintained an outward stoicism, but the atmosphere on the bridge was funereal. The staff officers moved like ghosts, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding direct contact. The radio traffic, once buzzing with confident signals and victory reports, was now reduced to terse, coded orders for withdrawal and hushed, fragmentary updates on the sinking of the carriers. The towering pagoda masts and the 18-inch guns, symbols of a bygone doctrine's ultimate expression, were now merely the ornaments of a failed titan. Yamamoto's great gamble, the Kantai Kessen, had not just failed. It had backfired with a cruelty that was almost literary. The trap he had laid for the Americans had sprung upon his own hand. His mind, so adept at calculating odds at the bridge table, now wrestled with the incalculable, the total loss of strategic initiative, the exposure of the Empire's fragile reach, and the personal responsibility for leading the nation's most cherished weapon to ruin. He drafted his report to Imperial General Headquarters, a document that would become a model of tragic understatement and obfuscation, the first stone in a wall of official lies that would hide the truth from the Japanese people for the duration of the war. To the northeast, the American task forces under Spruance also turned away, but their silence was of a different quality. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of adrenaline receding, of a day's triumph. The flight decks of Enterprise and Hornet, scarred and stained by the frantic operations of the past 3 days, were finally still. Men slept where they dropped, in corners of the hangar deck or at their battle stations, overcome by a fatigue that was as much emotional as physical.
There was no raucous celebration. The victory was too immense, too sudden, and purchased at too high a personal cost. The squadrons were skeletons. The ready rooms where briefings had been filled with animated young men were now hauntingly empty, chairs vacant, the chalkboard diagrams of the attack still staring at the survivors. The loss of the torpedo squadrons was a wound in the flesh of the carrier air groups, a sacrifice so complete it inspired awe and a sickening grief. The pilots of the dive bombers and fighters, the men who had delivered the victory, grappled with the images burned into their minds. The sight of friends spiraling into the sea in flames, the hellish infernos they had ignited on the Japanese flight decks, the desperate tilting struggle of the Yorktown. Their triumph was alloyed with trauma. On the bridge, Admiral Spruance, ever introspective, looked out at the darkening sea. His victory was clean on the strategic ledger, but he understood its human texture was ragged and painful. His decision to withdraw, to consolidate, and to preserve his force was a commander's cold calculus, but it was also an acknowledgement of his men's spent condition. The American fleet sailed east, bearing its exhausted warriors and its profound secret, the knowledge that the seemingly unstoppable foe could be broken. Meanwhile, on the tiny atoll that had been the battle's nominal prize, the garrison of Marines and aviators experienced a surreal deliverance. For days they had been the
anvil, braced for a hammer blow that never fully fell in the form of invasion. They had sent their antiquated planes on near-suicidal missions, watched their comrades fail to return, and endured naval bombardment from the distant Japanese cruiser group. Now, the horizon was empty of enemies. The relentless pressure, the expectation of a final, desperate ground battle simply evaporated. The emotional release was vertiginous. Men who had prepared to die on the sand and coral found themselves alive, the immediate threat gone. But the evidence of the greater battle surrounded them. The sky for days had been marked by the towering black pillars of smoke to the north. The radio chatter had told a confused but increasingly jubilant story. Wreckage washed ashore, Japanese life rafts, pieces of aircraft with red suns on the wings, and once, horrifically, bodies in dark uniforms. Midway had been saved not by its own defences, but by a naval victory fought over the horizon, a battle its defenders heard and glimpsed but did not see. Their role had been crucial. They had absorbed Nagumo's first strike and forced the fatal decision to rearm, but their experience was one of passive, anxious endurance rather than active triumph. Their legacy would be that of the tripwire, the steadfast garrison that held long enough for the fleet to deliver its knockout punch. Beneath the surface of the sea, another drama of silence unfolded. The American submarine Nautilus, under Commander William Brockman, had been an active, if frustrated, participant. It had fired torpedoes at a burning Japanese carrier, likely the Kaga, only to have them malfunction or hit without exploding. A chronic American torpedo problem that would plague the fleet for another year. It had been depth-charged, harassed, and had played a minor role in the chaotic cruiser collision. Now, in the battle's aftermath, the ocean floor became a graveyard. Over the ensuing days and weeks, the four Japanese carriers, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, and the American Yorktown and Hammond, settled into the eternal darkness of the abyssal plain over 3 miles down. Their sinking marked not an end, but a transformation. The steel hulls, once vibrant with light, noise, and the intense concentration of thousands of lives, became cold, silent tombs. They were monuments to a specific moment in time, to the technology and tactics of early 1942, to the men who lived and died within them. The deep sea, with its immense pressure and slow, relentless currents, would claim them, preserving their stories in a cryptic archaeological language. The silence there was absolute, a final note in the symphony of destruction, holding the physical truth of the battle in a perpetual, inaccessible vault. For the families of the lost, there would be no grave to visit, only the vast, empty blue of the Pacific chart on a map,
a representation of an absence as deep and profound as the ocean itself. In the days and weeks
that followed the battle, the task of confronting the new reality fell with unequal weight upon the victor and the vanquished. For the United States, the process was public, celebratory, and swiftly channeled into renewed mobilization. The news, carefully released by Navy censors after a security-conscious delay, broke upon the American public like a cleansing wave. Headlines screamed of a great naval victory and the turning of the tide. The detailed narratives focusing on the heroism of the dive bomber pilots and the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons provided a desperately needed counter-narrative to the 6 months of defeat and retreat. President Roosevelt, a master of public morale, framed it as a testament to American ingenuity and courage. The victory at Midway became an instant foundational myth, a proof that the Japanese were not supermen, that the war could be won, and that the sacrifices at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines would be avenged. This public reckoning was unifying and energizing. It justified the immense industrial conversion underway, bolstered faith in military leadership, and sent a surge of recruits into recruiting stations. The nation's psychology shifted from a defensive, vengeful crouch to an offensive, confident stride. Internally, the US Navy's confrontation was more analytical and urgent. Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor immediately focused on the next move. The victory was not an end, but the opening of a door. Intelligence intercepts soon confirmed the full scale of Japanese losses, emboldening the planning staff. The debate was not about whether to go on the offensive, but where. The result, Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, was launched with startling speed on August 7th, just 2 months later. This decision reflected a profound strategic confidence born at Midway. It was a bold, even risky amphibious operation, but it was undertaken with the knowledge that the Japanese carrier force was crippled and could not intervene decisively. The lessons of Midway, the need for better fighter coordination, improved torpedoes, relentless reconnaissance, were digested and implemented with the pragmatic urgency of a learning organization. The victory was a catalyst for accelerated action, not a reason for complacency. For Japan, the confrontation with the outcome was a dark exercise in secrecy, denial, and internal turmoil. The truth of the disaster was a state secret of the highest order. A veil was drawn across the home islands. The press, tightly controlled, published accounts of a great victory in the Aleutians and a fierce, costly battle near Midway where one American carrier was sunk and another damaged, while Japanese forces suffered the loss of one carrier, cargo was usually named, and damage to others. The public, fed on a diet of unbroken victory since Pearl Harbor, accepted this diluted version. The thousands of bereaved families received notifications that their sons had died in battle, with no details. The survivors from the sunken carriers, when they finally returned to Japan, were isolated, sworn to secrecy, and often reassigned to remote postings to prevent the truth from spreading through the fleet. This imposed silence created a schizophrenic reality, a public living in a manufactured continuum of success, and a naval high command operating in the shadow of a catastrophic truth. Within the Imperial Navy's upper echelons, the aftermath was a quiet storm of recrimination and despair. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo, which had always been skeptical of Yamamoto's Midway plan, now harbored a bitter, unspoken, "I told you so" resentment. Yamamoto, though still revered, saw his influence diminished. His strategic vision lay in ashes. The promised decisive battle had been decisive, but for the wrong side. The staff officers who had crafted the complex operation faced their own private hells, dissecting every decision, every missed signal, every moment of bad luck. The critique, however, remained largely tactical. There was no fundamental re-evaluation of Japan's grand strategy, no admission that the goal of securing an unchallengeable defensive perimeter was now impossible. Instead, the failure was absorbed as a temporary setback, a need to tighten defences and wait for the American counter-thrust, which they believed could be bled white. This failure of strategic imagination was perhaps Midway's most enduring poison for Japan. It prevented a realistic assessment of their predicament, ensuring the war would continue along a path of escalating attrition and ultimate ruin. The psychological impact on the fighting spirit of the Japanese Navy was deep and corrosive. For the rank-and-file sailor and the junior officer, the official story was suspect. The absence of so many familiar faces, the sudden subdued demeanour of senior officers, the obvious gaps in the fleet's order of battle when units returned to port, these were clues that could not be entirely erased. A rumour mill of terrifying efficiency took hold in the bars and barracks of Yokosuka and Kure. Whispers of all 4 carriers lost circulated, met with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The unshakable faith in victory, the sense of divine favour that had propelled them through the early conquests, was cracked. It was replaced not by defeatism, but by a hardened, darker resolve, a sense that the war had entered a new, desperate phase where victory was no longer assured, and survival itself would require ever greater sacrifices. This shift in consciousness, from the arrogance of the offensive to the grim determination of the defensive, was Midway's true spiritual casualty for Japan. The fleet that sailed forth after June 1942 was still brave and disciplined, but it was a fleet shadowed by a secret knowledge of its own vulnerability, a ghost fleet already haunted by the memory of a sunny morning when the sky fell in. The long-term impact of Midway on the individuals who shaped and fought the battle was as varied as their roles, a tapestry of honour, obscurity, guilt, and quiet endurance. For the American commanders, the battle became the defining moment of their careers. Chester Nimitz's leadership, characterized by trust in subordinates and calm strategic vision, was validated on the world stage. He became the indispensable man, shepherding the Pacific War to its conclusion with the authority that was now unquestioned. The victory shielded him from political interference and granted him the latitude to run the theatre as he saw fit. His legacy as one of history's great fleet commanders was secured in those first days of June. Raymond Spruance emerged from the battle an admiral of the first rank. His performance, the early launch decision, the calculated withdrawal, the relentless pursuit of the Hiryu, was a masterclass in operational art. The Spruance luck that some attributed his success to was, in reality, the product of a meticulous analytical mind and unflappable nerves. Midway made him. He would go on to command the Fifth Fleet through the Central Pacific's Great Island Hopping Campaign, winning the massive Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944. Yet, he remained an enigmatic private figure, uncomfortable with the public hero worship that followed Halsey. His legacy was one of quiet, overwhelming competence, a stark contrast to the flamboyance of some of his peers. For Frank Jack Fletcher, the outcome was more ambiguous. As the senior tactical commander, he had exercised sound judgment, launching searches, coordinating with Spruance, and fighting his ship fiercely. Yet, he was the commander who lost the Yorktown, just as he had lost the Lexington at Coral Sea. Fairly or not, a reputation for being carrier-shy or unlucky began to attach to him. Though he performed admirably in the Guadalcanal campaign, he was eventually rotated back to shore command. His frontline career effectively ended by the intertwining of circumstance and perception. The victory at Midway did not burnish his star, it subtly eclipsed it. The real architects of the victory, the intelligence officers, faced complex fates. Joseph Rochefort, whose brilliant deduction established the time and place of the battle, was not rewarded in the moment. His direct access to Nimitz and his unorthodox style had earned him powerful enemies in Washington, particularly in the Office of Naval Intelligence. In a bitter irony, after Midway, these rivals engineered his removal from Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. He was sidelined, given a training command, and never again played a major role in the war. The medal he so richly deserved was not awarded until decades after his death, a final belated acknowledgement of the debt owed to his genius. His legacy became one of posthumous redemption, a cautionary tale about bureaucratic pettleness overshadowing monumental contribution. For the airmen, the pilots and aircrew, Midway was a lifetime's experience compressed into hours. For men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who led the Enterprise dive bombers, and Lieutenant Richard Best, who personally bombed 2 carriers, a Kargi and a share of Karga, it was the pinnacle of their service. They became national heroes, their names synonymous with the miracle. They bore the fame with varying degrees of ease, but all carried the psychological scars of combat and the loss of friends. For the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, Ensign George Gay, his experience was a unique burden. Rescued after 30 hours in the water, he became a living symbol of sacrifice, toured the country to boost war bonds, his story told and retold. He was a monument to his squadron, a role that was both an honor and a lifelong weight. On the Japanese side, the personal aftermath was often tragic. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto lived for 9 more months, a period of grim defensive warfare. The defeat at Midway haunted him. His death in April 1943, shot down by American P-38s over Bougainville in an operation based on decrypted flight plans, a direct echo of the intelligence failure at Midway, was a kind of poetic justice. It cemented his martyr status in Japan, freezing his reputation in a heroic amber that largely obscured his strategic misjudgments. For Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, Midway was professional and personal annihilation. The cautious commander was shattered. He was given a series of lesser commands, a polite form of exile, ending up in the stagnant backwater of the Saipan garrison. There in July 1944, as American Marines overran his headquarters, he committed ritual suicide, seppuku, a final grim association with catastrophic defeat. His name became permanently linked with hesitation and lost opportunity. The younger, brilliant minds of the Kido Butai faced a future of frustration. Commander Minoru Genda, the heirs, tactician, survived the war, his talents wasted in a losing cause. He would later help found Japan's post-war air self-defense force, applying the hard lessons of carrier warfare to a new, defensive context. Commander Mitsuo Fushida, the hero of Pearl Harbor, recovered from his appendectomy to find his world destroyed. He became a staff officer, a witness to the Navy's long decline. After the war, he underwent a profound conversion, becoming a Christian evangelist and a reconciliatory figure, his life a stark journey from architect of surprise attack to preacher of peace. For the thousands of anonymous crewmen, the cooks, the engineers, the plane handlers, the gunners, the battle was a trauma that defined their lives, whether they survived or not. The American survivors returned to a hero's welcome, their stories part of a national epic. The Japanese survivors returned to silence, to a mandated amnesia, their pain private, their service to a lost cause shrouded in state-sponsored falsehood. Their long-term impact was in the memories they carried, and in some cases in the silence they kept for decades, until historians finally began to piece together the full human story from both sides of the horizon. The legacy of the Battle of Midway extends far beyond the alteration of a war's momentum. It reshaped the very paradigms of naval warfare, the geopolitical landscape of the Pacific, and the methodologies of historical conflict itself. In the annals of military strategy, Midway stands as the unequivocal coronation of the aircraft carrier as the capital ship of the modern age. The battle rendered the battleship, the dreadnought that had dominated naval thought for a generation, obsolescent. The majestic Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, spent the battle cruising uselessly hundreds of miles from the decisive action, a symbol of a bygone era. Future naval engagements, the Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, would be carrier duels, fought at ranges of 200 miles or more by aircraft pilots who never saw the hulls of the enemy ships they sank. The doctrine of the Fast Carrier Task Force, with its integrated rings of anti-aircraft cruisers and destroyers, was forged in the crucible of Midway and would become the template for American naval supremacy for the rest of the century and beyond. The battle also served as the most potent validation of signals intelligence, SIGINT, in the history of warfare. The work of Rochefort and his team was not merely supportive, it was determinative. It allowed a weaker force to ambush a stronger one, to be at the right place at the right time with its limited resources concentrated for maximum effect. This lesson transformed the relationship between intelligence services and operational commands. No longer would intelligence be a peripheral advisory function. It became a central shaping element of strategy. The massive Allied SIGINT efforts that followed, culminating in the breaking of the German Enigma and the continued reading of Japanese codes, can trace their elevated status and funding to the precedents set at Midway. The battle proved that wars could be won in the silent, windowless rooms of cryptanalysts as surely as on the waves or in the skies. Geopolitically, Midway ensured the contours of the post-war Pacific. By destroying Japan's offensive naval capability, it guaranteed that the United States, not Japan, would be the dominant power in the region after the war. It preserved Hawaii as a secure bastion, protected Australia and New Zealand from invasion and isolation, and allowed the United States to pursue a Germany-first strategy in relative security. The victory shaped the peace. It meant that when Japan surrendered in 1945, it was to an America that controlled the Pacific utterly, leading to an American-led occupation, the drafting of a new constitution, and the establishment of a security architecture that has defined East Asia for 8 decades. The alternative, a negotiated peace from a position of Japanese strength following a Midway victory, is a chilling counterfactual that might have seen a Japanese co-prosperity sphere stretching across the Pacific, with incalculable consequences for China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the world. For the craft of history, Midway endures as the ultimate case study in the role of chance, or friction, in war. The delayed launch of the Tone Scout plane, McCluskey's decision to follow the Arashi's wake, the precise timing of the American dive-bombing attack at the moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability, these are not elements of a tidy plan, but the chaotic human elements that decide battles. The battle dismantles the myth of the inevitable clockwork operation. It demonstrates that even the most brilliant plan, and Yamamoto's was brilliant in its conception, is hostage to the decisions of junior officers, the performance of machinery, the weather, and the independent will of the enemy. Historians and military theorists have pored over its details for generations, not to find a perfect model to replicate, but to understand the complex interplay of planning, intelligence, courage, and sheer luck that defines what Karl von Clausewitz called the fog of war. Culturally, Midway entered the American mythos as the miracle. This framing was not accidental. After the trauma of Pearl Harbor, a victory against such odds felt heaven-sent. It provided a clean, heroic narrative to a nation hungry for redemption. The stories of the doomed torpedo squadrons and the diving dauntless pilots became archetypal tales of sacrifice and decisive action, told and retold in newspapers, newsreels, books, and later, films. It created a pantheon of heroes, Spruance, McCluskey, Best, and cemented the US Navy's reputation for resilience and innovation. For Japan, the cultural legacy was one of a hidden trauma, a void in the official history. The truth, when it finally emerged after the war, came as a shock, forcing a painful reassessment of the entire Pacific War narrative. It became a key piece of evidence in understanding the fatal hubris of the militarist regime. Finally, on a humanistic level, the enduring significance of Midway lies in its stark illustration of the fragility of assumptions. The Japanese assumption of their own invincibility and of American weakness and disorganization was shattered in 5 minutes. The American assumption after Pearl Harbor that they were facing an unbeatable foe was shattered in the same instant. The battle is a permanent reminder that in conflict, psychological factors, morale, perception, the will to fight, are as critical as numbers of ships or planes. It demonstrates how quickly the tide of history can turn, hinging on a handful of decisions made by individuals under unimaginable pressure. The quiet atoll, the vast ocean, the depths holding the shattered hulls, all serve as a monument to this truth, that the course of events is never preordained, that courage and chance are inextricably linked, and that a single battle in the right place at the right time can indeed alter the destiny of the world. The reflection on the legacy and meaning of the Battle of Midway leads inevitably to the shores of the atoll itself and the silent depths that surround it, where memory is physically entombed. Today, Midway Atoll, known as Pihemanu in Hawaiian, is a remote wildlife refuge, a domain of goonie birds, lice and albatross, monk seals, and marine life. The rusting gun emplacements, the crumbling concrete command posts, and the overrun runways are the only visible signs of the cataclysm that once raged in the skies above and the seas around. The atoll has been reclaimed by nature, a process that feels like both a healing and an erasure. For the occasional historian or pilgrim who visits, the contrast is profound. The utter tranquility of the present against the remembered violence of the past. The screech of albatrosses replaces the scream of dive brakes. The crash of surf substitutes for the thunder of bombs. This peaceful coexistence is the final, ironic chapter of the battle's story, the ultimate insignificance of the territorial prize for which it was ostensibly fought. Midway the place survived to become a sanctuary, while midway the battle achieved a significance that transcended geography entirely. Beneath the waves the legacy is more starkly preserved. The wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Yorktown, and Mikuma were lost for decades, their exact locations mysteries shrouded in 3 miles of darkness. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a series of deep-sea expeditions led by figures like Dr. Robert Ballard and later by the teams from the Vulcan Inc. organization set out to find these lost titans. Using advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles, they plunged into the abyss. The discoveries were breathtaking and somber. The ships were found, resting upright on the seabed in various states of preservation. Yorktown was remarkably intact, her anti-aircraft guns still pointed skyward, as if frozen in the moment of her final battle. The Japanese carriers were more ravaged, their flight decks collapsed from internal explosions, but their forms were instantly recognizable. These were not just wrecks, they were time capsules, sealed by immense pressure and eternal night. The exploration of these sites forced a new kind of confrontation with the battle's legacy. The footage brought back of a diver's plane on Yorktown's hangar deck, of the iconic Hiryu's island structure, of a sake bottle on Kaga's bridge, had a powerful humanizing effect. These were not abstract casualties of war, but the very rooms and corridors where thousands lived, worked, and died. The discoveries prompted a wave of renewed historical interest and, importantly, a spirit of reconciliation. The expeditions were conducted with respect, treated as war graves. Japanese officials and families of the lost were involved and consulted. The finding of the wrecks provided a form of closure for descendants on both sides, a tangible, if inaccessible, resting place for their loved ones. It also served as a grim audit of the battle's violence, confirming the forensic details of the sinkings and silencing decades of speculation and myth. The enduring meaning of Midway in a modern context is multifaceted. For the United States Navy, it remains the foundational victory of its modern carrier-dominated identity. The lessons of intelligence integration, decentralized command exemplified by Spruance's and Fletcher's on-scene decisions, and the necessity of air superiority are drilled into every officer. The battle is a constant reference point, a reminder of the service's ability to adapt and overcome after a staggering initial blow. For military strategists globally, Midway is the textbook example of a tactical action achieving decisive strategic effect. It is studied not just for what happened, but for how a weaker force can defeat a stronger one through superior information, interior lines, and the concentration of force at the critical point. On a broader human level, Midway's significance lies in its demonstration of the pivot. In the long, grinding narrative of World War II, certain moments stand out as hinges: Stalingrad, El Alamein, Midway. These were the points where Axis momentum was broken, where the sprawling, complex war turned. Midway's pivot was uniquely clean and dramatic, a single sharp engagement that reversed the flow of an entire ocean war. It teaches that history is not a smooth continuum, but a series of thresholds, and that passing through them can happen with terrifying speed. Finally, the battle endures as a parable about the dangers of cultural and intellectual arrogance. The Japanese entered the battle with what historian John Keegan called an excessive sense of operational elegance. They believed in their own ritualized perfection, in the divine wind of their fortune, and in the predictable reactions of a foe they considered inferior. This arrogance blinded them to possibility, the possibility of their codes being broken, of their scout planes being late, of the enemy arriving from an unexpected vector, of their own invincible carriers being turned into funeral pyres by a handful of well-placed bombs. The American victory, conversely, was built on humility before the facts. The humility of Nimitz to trust his intelligence chief, of Spruance to acknowledge his limitations and rely on his airmen, of the pilots to press home their attacks despite overwhelming odds. In an age where technological hubris and cultural misunderstanding still drive conflict, the lessons of Midway about the value of humility, adaptability, and the relentless pursuit of truth remain not just relevant but essential. The silence of the deep, where the wreckage lies, and the cry of the birds over the atoll are not just postscripts to a battle. They are its ongoing echo, a perpetual reminder of the day the world turned, and of the fragile human qualities that made it turn. The legacy of the Battle of Midway did not settle calmly into the pages of history. It erupted into the post-war world as a contested memory, a source of national pride, scholarly debate, and profound personal quiet. For the victors, the narrative solidified quickly into an orthodox canon, the miracle wrought by intelligence, courage, and divine fortune. This orthodoxy was enshrined in the first official histories, in the 1949 film Sands of Iwo Jima, which opened with a Midway flashback, and in the personal memoirs of key participants like Mitsuo Fuchida, whose Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, co-written, became a foundational text, albeit one filtered through his own perspective and agenda. The American version was clean, heroic, and strategically tidy, a tale of the underdog prevailing through grit and cleverness. It served a nation moving into a Cold War, a useful parable of vigilance and the rewards of technological and intellectual investment. The Central Intelligence Agency, successor to the OSS, could point to Rochefort as a patron saint of signals intelligence, a validation for its burgeoning shadow wars. The US Navy's entire post-war identity, built around the supercarrier and global power projection, rested on the foundational myth that Midway had validated this path. In Japan, the truth emerged slowly, painfully, and incompletely. The defeat had been so carefully concealed that its full scope came as a second shock after 1945. As the occupation authorities allowed historical inquiry and former officers began to speak, the scale of the disaster gradually came to light. The Japanese public, fed for years on the myth of the great victory off Midway Island, had to reconcile this
with the reality of catastrophic loss. This reckoning was not a single event, but a slow cultural osmosis. It contributed to a complex post-war psychology, a deep ambivalence toward the militarist past, a pacifist sentiment born of betrayed sacrifice, and a lingering private shame among veterans who felt they had failed their country and their fallen comrades. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established in 1954, studied Midway not as a glorious epic, but as a clinical case study in operational failure, the dangers of overcomplexity, the critical need for reconnaissance, and the fatal price of underestimating an opponent. The battle became, for Japan's new defensive forces, a negative blueprint, a lesson in everything to avoid. For the individuals who survived, the battle was a lifetime companion. Some, like American dive bomber leader Wade McCluskey, remained naval aviators, their careers forever defined by that one day in June. Others left the service and tried to build
ordinary lives, but found the memories inescapable. Reunions of the Torpedo Squadron associations were somber affairs, gatherings of the very few. The heroes often carried a quiet guilt, a sense that their survival was an unearned gift paid for by the lives of their squadron mates. George Gay, the sole survivor of VT-8, lived with the peculiar burden of being a monument to a unit. Every interview, every speech was an act of remembrance for 29 others. On the Japanese side, survivors who had kept the secret for years found a measure of relief in being able to speak, but also reopened old wounds. Their stories, when they finally told them, often focused not on grand strategy, but on the sensory horrors, the heat of the flight deck fires, the screams from the hangars, the taste of fuel oil in the water, the sight of a flagship burning against the sunset. For these men, the legacy was not strategic, but existential, a permanent seam in the fabric of their being. The battle also left a permanent imprint on the families of the lost. Over 3,000 Japanese and 300 Americans perished. For decades, these families had only the ocean as a grave. The later discovery of the wrecks by deep-sea explorers like Robert Ballard, who found Yorktown in 1998, and the teams from Vulcan Inc., who located the Japanese carriers in 2019, provided a profound, if abstract, form of closure. Ceremonies were held, footage was shared with families, and the sites were designated as war graves, protected by international agreement. These technological pilgrimages bridged the past and present, allowing a new generation to witness the final resting places of the ships that had defined their grandparents' or great-grandparents' lives. The legacy became tangible, resting in the eerie, silent beauty of the ROV footage, a rusting anti-aircraft gun on Yorktown's catwalk, a porcelain sake cup on Kaga's bridge. These images served as a powerful non-verbal testament to the scale of the loss and the passage of time, transmuting instruments of war into archaeological relics, their violence softened by the gentle sedimentation of the deep. The strategic and operational lessons of the Battle of Midway hardened into doctrine, becoming the bedrock of post-war American naval power and offering timeless insights for the study of conflict. The most unequivocal lesson was the ascendance of the aircraft carrier as the primary instrument of sea control and power projection. The US Navy's entire post-war fleet structure, centered on supercarrier battle groups, is the direct legacy of that June morning. The concept of the carrier task force, with its integrated air wing, protective ring of Aegis cruisers and destroyers, and accompanying attack submarines, is the evolved descendant of the ad hoc groups Fletcher and Spruance led. The battle proved that future naval warfare would be a contest of air superiority fought over the horizon, a lesson absorbed not only by America but by every major navy in the world. Intelligence, or more broadly, information dominance, was cemented as a decisive combat multiplier. Midway stands as the classic example of how superior knowledge of enemy intentions can offset numerical inferiority. The modern US military's vast investment in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, from satellites to drones to cyber capabilities, traces its philosophical lineage to Rochefort's dungeon. The lesson is that winning the scouting battle, knowing where the enemy is and what he intends before he knows the same about you, is often the prelude to victory in the shooting battle. This has expanded beyond signals intelligence to encompass every domain of information, making Midway a foundational case study in what is now called information warfare. The battle also provided a masterclass in the principles of war, particularly mass, surprise, and economy of force. The Americans, though outnumbered, achieved local mass by concentrating their 3 carriers against Nagumo's 4 at the critical moment. They achieved strategic surprise by being where the Japanese did not expect them. They used economy of force by using Midway itself as a fixed, unsinkable platform to harass and distract the enemy. Conversely, the Japanese violation of these principles was glaring. They dispersed their forces across the North Pacific, forfeited surprise through compromised signals, and failed to mass their overwhelming strength at the point of contact, leaving Nagumo's carriers unsupported. Modern military curricula use Midway as a prime example of both the application and the violation of these timeless maxims. On a tactical level, Midway underscored the lethal importance of readiness states. The Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible condition, flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft in the midst of a rearming cycle. This loaded deck vulnerability became a paramount concern for all. Navies, driving doctrines of rapid arming and spotting, enhanced deck park procedures, and aggressive combat air patrol schedules. The value of damage control was also starkly illustrated. The Yorktown, though fatally wounded, stayed afloat for days thanks to heroic damage control, while the Japanese carriers, with less robust procedures and more volatile aircraft handling, were consumed quickly. This lesson directly influenced warship design and crew training for generations. Perhaps the most profound command lesson is the value of mission command and decentralized execution. Nimitz gave his on-scene commanders, Fletcher and Spruance, clear intent, inflict maximum damage, governed by calculated risk, and the authority to execute. Spruance's decision to launch early, based on his assessment of the fleeting opportunity, was a classic example of empowered subordinate leadership. The Japanese system, by contrast, was rigid and centralized. Nagumo awaited orders from the Thii, distant Yamamoto, and was constrained by a complex preordained plan that allowed little deviation. The American system proved more adaptable to the chaotic fog of war. This lesson resonates in modern network-centric warfare, which emphasizes shared awareness and commanders' intent over rigid top-down control. For national strategy, Midway offers a cautionary tale about the limits of operational brilliance in the face of strategic overreach. Yamamoto's plan was the operational masterpiece but a strategic fantasy, based on the hope that a single knockout blow could compel a negotiated peace with an industrial power just awakening to its rage. It confused tactical success with strategic outcome, a recurring danger in military history. The battle demonstrates that no amount of clever planning or martial skill can ultimately compensate for a profound mismatch in industrial capacity, political will, and strategic depth. It is the ultimate rebuke to the idea that a short, sharp war can succeed against a determined major power. Finally, Midway teaches a humbling lesson about contingency and the role of chance. For all the brilliant intelligence and planning, the battle hinged on a chain of contingent events. A delayed scout plane, a submarine sighting, a destroyer's wake, a squadron commander's fuel-critical decision. It reminds strategists that while planning is essential, no plan survives contact with the enemy, and that the human element, the decisions of junior officers, the performance of individuals under stress, can overturn the most careful calculations. In an age of artificial intelligence and automated warfare, Midway stands as a timeless reminder that conflict remains a profoundly human endeavor,
subject to the caprices of courage, fear, insight, and luck. Its legacy is not a checklist of guaranteed success, but a complex tapestry of principles and warnings, a foundational text in the eternal study of how and why battles are won and lost. The final meaning of the Battle of Midway resides not in the strategic diagrams or the tonnage sunk, but in the silent, enduring questions it poses about memory, destiny, and the nature of history itself. The atoll today is a quiet sentinel in a vast ocean, a place where the cries of seabirds have replaced the roar of aircraft engines. This piece is the battle's ultimate ironic epilogue. The spot fought over with such titanic fury has reverted to its primordial state, a haven for life, indifferent to the human dramas that once played out above its lagoons. This juxtaposition, the transient violence of history against the enduring cycles of nature, is Midway's most profound metaphor. The coral polyps build upon the wreckage of landing gear. The albatross nests near the rusting gun emplacement. The battle, for all its world-altering consequence, is a temporary scar on a timeless seascape, a reminder of the smallness of human conflicts against the scale of geologics. Time. Yet, in that smallness lies an immense significance. Midway demonstrates how specific human-scale actions, a cryptanalyst's deduction, an admiral's order, a pilot's aim, can concatenate to alter the destiny of nations. It affirms the power of individual agency within the sweep of vast historical forces. The battle is a repudiation of historical determinism. The inevitable American industrial victory, had the Kido Butai triumphed at Midway, would have been delayed for years, at a cost of hundreds of thousands more lives, and might have resulted in a different geopolitical world altogether. History turned on a hinge that day, and the hinge was moved by conscious, courageous, and fallible human hands. The battle also forces a contemplation of memory and its curation. For decades, two parallel memories existed: the American public memory of heroic miracle and the Japanese official memory of veiled victory. Both were simplification serving national needs. The slow, painstaking work of historians, archaeologists, and descendants has woven these strands into a more complete, tragic, and respectful tapestry. The discovery of the wrecks acted as a powerful, non-ideological truth-teller, providing physical evidence that transcended national narratives. The legacy of Midway, therefore, is also a lesson in the maturation of memory, the journey from myth through secrecy toward a shared, albeit painful, understanding. It is a process that requires time, the opening of archives, the silencing of guns, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. In the end, Midway endures because it is a story of reversal so complete it feels archetypal. It is the moment the predator became the prey, when the hunter's perfect trap snapped shut on its own leg. It is a classic tragedy in the Greek sense. The Japanese, for all their skill and courage, were brought low by a fatal flaw: hubris, an arrogance born of 6 months of unchecked success that blinded them to possibility and to the resilience of their opponent. The Americans, reeling from defeat, displayed the classic qualities of the tragic hero's ascent: humility, adaptability, and a capacity for sacrifice. The dramatic structure is pristine, a fact that lends the battle its enduring narrative power. For the contemporary world, Midway's relevance is not in its specific weaponry, but in its enduring themes. In an era of great power competition, it warns of the dangers of underestimating an adversary's resilience and capacity for innovation. In the information age, it underscores that the contest for knowledge is prior to and definitive of the contest of arms. For leaders, it teaches the value of empowering trusted subordinates and the perils of over-complex, rigid planning. For citizens, it is a reminder that the freedoms and geopolitical realities they take for granted were purchased at a price and decided in moments of extreme peril that could have gone another way. The
quiet atoll and the deep-sea graves are the physical bookends of this story. One is a place of life and light, the other a realm of darkness and preservation. Between them lies the immense volume of the Pacific, across which the fleets moved and the aircraft flew. The battle's true monument is this empty space, the ocean itself, which witnessed the event and then concealed its evidence. The meaning of Midway is carried not in stone, but in the continued study of those few days, in the respect paid to the fallen of both sides, and in the unwavering vigilance required to prevent such a cataclysm from being necessary again. It was more than a battle, it was a clarification. It cut through the fog of war and the illusion of invincibility to reveal a new truth, that the Pacific and the world it touched would henceforth follow a different course. The roaring dawn of June 4th, 1942 gave way to a silence that was not an end, but the birth of a new reality, a reality whose contours we still navigate today. The echoes of those 5 decisive minutes have never truly faded. They resonate in the strategic calculations of nations, in the design of warships, in the silent watch of intelligence agencies, and in the quiet memories of the last survivors, for whom the smell of salt air and the sound of a radial engine will always bring them back to the place where, they knew, the world turned.